They laughed at him before he even reached the altar. A grease-stained mechanic. No family. No name anyone recognized. Walking into Saint Augustine Hall holding a 7-year-old girl's hand while 500 powerful people stared like he'd wandered in from the wrong side of town. And standing at the end of that aisle, Victoria Langford, 30 years old, CEO, worth more than most small countries. She was waiting for him. Nobody understood it. Nobody respected it. But before this night was over, every single person in that room would learn exactly who Mason Reed really was. Hit like, drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The temperature had dropped to somewhere around 28 degrees by the time Mason Reed pulled his 10-year-old Ford pickup into the parking lot of Saint Augustine Hall, and the engine made that familiar knocking sound it always made in cold weather. The one he kept meaning to fix but never found the time for, because fixing other people's problems had always come before fixing his own. He sat there for a moment with the engine off, hands still on the wheel, watching his breath fog the windshield. In the rear-view mirror, Sophie was already awake, already watching him with those dark, serious eyes she'd inherited from a woman he tried not to think about too often. She had her good dress on, navy blue with small white buttons down the front, and her hair was pulled into 2 braids that he'd spent 45 minutes attempting that morning, redoing 3 times until they were passable. Not perfect, but passable. "Daddy," she said quietly, "is your stomach hurting?" "No, baby. You're making the face." "What face?" "The one you make when your stomach hurts, but you don't want to say it." He turned around and looked at her fully. 7 years old and already reading him better than most adults ever managed. He reached back and straightened the collar of her dress, which didn't need straightening. "I'm good," he said. "You ready?" Sophie looked at the hall through the window. Even from the parking lot, you could see the lights blazing inside, could hear the faint sound of strings playing something classical. Luxury cars were everywhere. Mercedes, BMWs, a Bentley parked sideways across 2 spaces like the driver knew nobody would say anything about it. "There's a lot of fancy cars," Sophie observed. "Yeah." "Are those people our friends?" Mason thought about that longer than he should have. "Some of them will be," he said finally. "Come on." He helped her out of the truck, straightened his own jacket, charcoal gray, off the rack from a department store in Burlington, pressed the night before with an iron that leaked steam from a crack in the side, and they walked toward the entrance together. The valet at the door looked at the Ford pickup, then looked at Mason. The expression on the kid's face lasted only a second before professional training smoothed it away, but Mason caught it. He always caught it. He handed over the keys without a word. Inside, Saint Augustine Hall was everything the name implied it would be. Vaulted ceilings, columns wrapped in white ribbon, and flowers that probably cost more per stem than Mason charged per labor hour, chandeliers casting everything in warm amber light. The guest list was somewhere around 500 people, though Mason hadn't seen the final number. Victoria had handled the planning. She'd offered to loop him in, and he'd told her to do whatever made her happy, which in retrospect he understood was probably the wrong answer, but she'd laughed at it rather than taking offense. And that was one of the things he loved about her. The room was full of people who knew each other, which meant it was full of people who didn't know him. He felt the eyes immediately. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody stopped talking. Nobody pointed. It was subtler than that. The way conversations briefly paused when he passed. The way certain heads turned and then turned back. The way small assessments happened in the fraction of a second before social grace reasserted itself. He recognized the mechanics of it because he'd spent most of his adult life being invisible in rooms like this, and invisibility had taught him to read people the way a good mechanic reads an engine. Through vibration, through sound, through the small things that don't look like symptoms until you know what you're looking for. Sophie pressed closer to his side. A woman in a silver dress, mid-50s, neck draped in pearls, the kind of social confidence that came from decades of never questioning whether she belonged somewhere, looked at Mason and then at Sophie and then back at Mason with an expression that asked 3 questions simultaneously without her having to open her mouth. "Who are you? Why are you here? And who let you in?" Mason nodded at her. She turned away. "There's a lot of people," Sophie said quietly. "Big wedding." "Do you know any of them?" "A few." This was technically true. He knew Victoria. Obviously. He knew her assistant, Claire, who had been running back and forth between the bridal suite and the main hall for the past 2 hours based on the 3 texts she'd sent him. He knew Edward Whittaker, though Whittaker wasn't here yet. His flight from Brussels had been delayed, according to the last message Mason had received, and Whittaker's version of delayed meant something different from most people's version. Because Whittaker traveled on a private jet, and delayed, in that context, meant the meeting he was in had run long. Not that he was stuck in an airport somewhere eating an overpriced sandwich. Other than that, Mason didn't know the room, but the room was quickly forming opinions about him. He found a spot near the edge of the gathering area, close enough to the bar that he could get water for Sophie without navigating too much of the crowd. She'd found a small chair near a pillar and was sitting with the careful posture of a child who had been reminded to sit up straight and was taking it seriously. He got her a glass of water and a small plate of appetizers from a passing tray. Tiny crackers with something on them that he didn't recognize but that Sophie ate without complaint, and stood nearby, watching the room the way he always watched rooms. Quietly. Without performing. 2 men in expensive suits were talking about 8 feet away, voices low but not as low as they thought. Saw him pull up in a pickup truck, an old pickup truck. She could have literally anyone. Her family's been trying to set her up with Darren Walsh for 2 years. The man runs a hedge fund. I heard he doesn't even have family here. Nobody came for him. Well, that says something, doesn't it? Mason stared at the far wall and said nothing. Sophie had heard it too. She was looking at her water glass, very carefully, not looking at anything else. Then she looked up at him with an expression that was trying hard to be neutral and not quite managing it. "Daddy," she said softly, "is nobody coming for us?" And there it was. That sentence, small and honest and devastating in the way that only a 7-year-old's honesty could be devastating. Not because she was trying to hurt him, but because she wasn't. She was just asking. The way children ask things before they learn that some questions are better left unasked. Mason crouched down in front of her so they were at eye level. He didn't look around first to see who was watching. He didn't lower his voice. "What do you think?" he asked. Sophie considered this with the gravity she brought to most things. "I think maybe nobody's coming." "Then what does that mean?" "We'll be alone?" "Or," he said, "we'll have more room." She thought about this. Something in her expression shifted, not fully convinced, but willing to sit with it. She nodded once, slowly, the way she nodded when she was filing something away to think about later. He stood back up. Across the room, he caught a glimpse of Victoria's uncle, Gerald Langford, 63, the kind of man who owned multiple properties and wore that ownership in his posture, looking at Mason with the careful, studied attention of someone building a case. Gerald had never liked this engagement. He hadn't said so outright, because men like Gerald rarely said things outright, but he had managed to communicate it through a series of increasingly pointed questions at dinner 6 weeks ago. Questions about Mason's plans and his trajectory, and what his vision was for Victoria's future. Mason had answered each one plainly and without embellishment, which Gerald had apparently found either unsatisfying or suspicious, because by the end of the meal his questions had taken on a certain prosecutorial quality. Now Gerald was talking to a man Mason didn't recognize, and the angle of his body and the direction of his gaze made the subject of the conversation fairly clear. Mason picked up Sophie's empty plate and went to find a trash can. The bridal suite was on the 2nd floor of the hall, at the end of a corridor lined with framed photographs of other people's weddings, other people's best days, all of them smiling with the particular brightness of moments that had been planned for months and now had finally arrived. Claire met him at the door. She was 28, efficient in the way of someone who had spent years being the most organized person in any given room, and she looked at Mason with the focused energy of someone managing 17 things at once. "She wants to see you," Claire said. "I know it's technically bad luck or whatever, but she specifically said." "It's fine," Mason said. "Sophie, stay with Claire for a minute." Sophie looked up at Claire with the frank assessment of a child deciding whether an adult was trustworthy. Claire passed, apparently. Sophie took her hand without argument. Mason knocked once and went in. Victoria was standing at the window with her back to the door, and when she turned around he stopped moving for just a second, which he hadn't expected. He'd seen her in the dress twice during fittings, but something about seeing her now, in this room, in this light, 30 minutes before they were supposed to stand at the altar, made his chest do something complicated. She was beautiful. That wasn't new information. But there was something else in her face right now, something underneath the carefully applied composure, and he recognized it because he'd worn the same thing for years. The specific look of someone who wasn't sure they deserved the thing they were about to receive. "You look scared," he said. "I'm not scared," she said immediately. "Okay. I'm recalibrating." "What does that mean?" "It means Gerald cornered me this morning and spent 20 minutes listing reasons why this was a mistake." She turned back to the window briefly, then back to him. He used the phrase long-term viability 4 times in reference to our marriage. "What did you say?" "I said, thank you for your concern, Gerald, and then I came up here and Claire gave me a protein bar because apparently my blood sugar was affecting my decision-making." She paused. "I don't think it was my blood sugar." "Probably wasn't," Mason agreed. She looked at him for a long moment. "How are you doing? Out there?" "Fine." "Mason." "I'm fine," he said. "It's a room. I've been in rooms. I know what they're saying about you. I know too. It doesn't bother you?" He thought about Sophie's face when she'd asked if nobody was coming for them. He thought about the way her voice had stayed careful and controlled, the way she was already, at 7 years old, learning how to manage the size of her own pain. "It bothers me for Sophie," he said. "Not for me." Victoria pressed her lips together. "I'm sorry. I didn't think it would be this. You don't need to apologize for other people." "No, but—" She stopped. Started again. "This is supposed to be good. This is a good day. And I don't want her to spend it feeling like she's somewhere she doesn't belong." "She'll be all right," Mason said. But he was already thinking about the phone call he'd made 2 days ago, about the conversation that had followed, about the thing he'd set in motion that he hadn't told Victoria about yet. "You sure?" Victoria asked. "Not completely," he said, "but close enough." She laughed at that. A real laugh. Unexpected. The kind that loosened something in her face. He crossed the room and she reached up and straightened his lapel, which was already straight. "You ironed this yourself," she said. "How can you tell?" "The crease is slightly off on the left side." "The iron leaks." "Mason, you own—" She stopped herself, then laughed again, softer. "You could buy a new iron. The old one still works," he said. "It just leaks." She shook her head, but she was still smiling. He went back down 15 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, and the hall had filled further in his absence. More bodies, more murmured conversations, more of the particular social energy of a room full of people who measured each other automatically and couldn't quite turn it off even at a wedding. Sophie was sitting with Claire near a side wall. She'd eaten another cracker and was watching the room with an expression Mason recognized as careful observation. She was mapping the space the way he'd taught her to map spaces, identifying exits, identifying faces, understanding the layout before committing to any particular spot in it. She saw him, and some of the tension went out of her small shoulders. "Can I sit with you?" she asked when he reached her. "Always." He took the seat next to her, and she immediately leaned into his arm, which she did when she was processing something and didn't want to talk about it yet. He let her. He'd learned early that Sophie processed things in her own time, and that pressing her before she was ready just pushed the conversation underground, where it became harder to reach. They sat together and watched the room. Then Gerald Langford appeared. He walked over with the measured deliberateness of someone who had decided to have a conversation and wasn't going to be dissuaded by circumstances. He was built like someone who had been athletic in his 40s and was now carrying the evidence of too many business dinners. And he had the particular kind of face that was handsome in photographs, but in person carried an expression of permanent faint dissatisfaction. "Mason," he said. "It was the way you said a word when you were practicing patience." "Gerald, I thought we might have a moment." "Sure." Gerald glanced at Sophie, who was looking up at him with wide, direct eyes. He redirected his attention to Mason. "I want to make sure we understand each other." "All right." "Victoria is—" He paused. Regrouped. "She's led this family's interest for 6 years. She's built something significant. Her judgment in business is—" Another pause. "Exceptional. But personally, she's always been impulsive, emotional, in ways that—" "She's in the other room if you want to have this conversation with her," Mason said evenly. Gerald's jaw tightened. I'm having it with you. Okay. What I'm saying is that I don't understand this. He said this the way you said a word when what you meant was a word you'd decided not to say in public. I've watched you for the past 20 minutes. You don't know half these people. You pulled up in a truck that belongs in a junkyard. You brought a child to a formal event. She's my daughter, Mason said. She goes where I go. That's exactly the point. Your life and Victoria's life they don't align. They don't fit. And in 5 years, when she's negotiating a merger in London and He stopped. Whatever you do in that garage. I fix things, Mason said. Yes. Gerald seemed to find this confirmation of something. And that's admirable. But it's not. If you're asking whether I can take care of her, Mason said, you're asking the wrong question. Am I? The right question is whether she's happy. He kept his voice level and unhurried. You've known Victoria for 30 years. Has she seemed happy? Gerald's mouth opened and then closed. Sophie was watching this exchange with the focused attention of a child at a tennis match. She is happy, Gerald said finally, and the word came out slightly strangled, like it cost him something to say it. Then we understand each other, Mason said. Gerald stood there for another 3 seconds, which was long enough to make it clear he hadn't been dismissed, and then walked away. Sophie pressed closer to Mason's arm. He doesn't like you, she whispered. No. Why? Because he doesn't know me. Is that why people don't like each other? Because they don't know each other? He looked down at her. Most of the time, he said. Yeah. She thought about this. Then why don't they just learn? He didn't have a good answer for that, so he kissed the top of her head instead. The ceremony was scheduled for 7 o'clock. At 6:49, Mason heard them. It started as a low vibration, felt before it was heard, the way you feel a bass note in your chest before your ears register it. Then it became sound. Then the sound became distinct, engines, multiple engines, high performance, well-tuned, the sound of machines built for distance and maintained with care. The conversations in the hall faltered. People near the windows moved toward them. Someone near the main entrance pushed open one of the heavy doors, and cold air rushed in along with something else. The wash of headlights sweeping across the parking lot in formation. 7 vehicles, black, moving in the kind of coordinated precision that didn't happen by accident. Mason stood up. Sophie stood up next to him and took his hand, craning to see past the adults who were moving toward the entrance with the poorly concealed curiosity of people who had been raised to be discreet but were currently losing the battle. The vehicle stopped. Doors opened. Men in dark suits emerged, 12 of them, then more, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who did this kind of thing regularly and had stopped finding it remarkable. They arranged themselves with a quiet professionalism that was somehow more impressive than any display would have been. And then Edward Whittaker stepped out, 67 years old, gray at the temples, the kind of lean that came from discipline rather than deprivation, carrying himself with the complete stillness of a man who had not been in a hurry in 20 years because he had the resources to make time wait for him. He wore a dark suit that cost more than most cars and wore it the way men wore clothes they never thought about because they'd long since stopped having to. He walked through the entrance of Saint Augustine Hall without breaking stride, and the crowd parted in that particular way crowds part for certain people. Not because anyone told them to, but because something in the bearing of the man made the parting feel correct. He walked directly to Mason and stopped and bowed his head. It was not a deep bow. It was not theatrical. It was the precise, small, deliberate inclination of the head that meant something specific in certain circles. Acknowledgement, respect, the kind offered between equals or, in some cases, upward. Mr. Reed, Whittaker said, my sincere apologies for the delay. The Brussels meeting ran considerably past schedule. We came directly from the airport. The hall was completely silent. Mason shook his hand. You made it, he said. That's what matters. Of course. Whittaker glanced around the room with the calm attention of someone cataloging things without judgment. Is Sophie here? Right here, Sophie said, stepping forward with the directness she'd apparently decided was appropriate for the situation. Whittaker looked down at her with an expression that softened visibly. Miss Reed, you look very nice. Thank you, Sophie said. You have a lot of cars. We do. Is that because you're important? Sophie, Mason started. It's a fair question, Whitaker said. He crouched slightly, which, for a man of his bearing, was a notable physical concession. Some people have a lot of cars because they think it makes them look important. We have a lot of cars because there are a lot of us, and we all needed to get here, and we wanted to make sure we arrived together. He paused. Does that make sense? Sophie considered him for a moment with the thorough assessment she gave everyone. Yeah, she said finally. That makes sense. Whitaker straightened and looked at Mason. Something passed between them. A look that carried the weight of a long history, a relationship built over years, across distances, through things neither of them would have described to this room even if asked. Shall we? Whitaker said. The hall was not the same after that. Mason could feel it. The air in a room changed when the social order shifted, and the social order had just shifted completely, and everyone present knew it, even if most of them didn't yet understand the mechanism of the shift. The whispers that resumed were different whispers. Who is that? That's Edward Whitaker, from Whitaker Capital. I know who Whitaker is. Why is he here? He bowed. Did you see? He actually... Who is Mason Reed? That was the question now. That was the question spreading through the room like a current, moving from cluster to cluster, arriving at different people at different moments, and landing with different weight depending on how much they thought they already knew. Gerald Langford was standing near the back wall with two men Mason recognized as family attorneys, and Gerald's face had undergone a significant reorganization. The careful dissatisfaction that had been its resting state for the entire evening was gone. In its place was something raw. Not quite embarrassment, not quite alarm, but somewhere in the territory between them. He was looking at Mason with new eyes. Mason didn't look back. Sophie tugged his sleeve. Daddy, she said quietly, those people are looking at you different now. I know. Why? Because Mr. Whitaker came. Did you tell him to come? He looked down at her. I asked him, he said. 2 days ago. I called and asked if he'd come. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the hall continued its recalibration. 500 people simultaneously revising their understanding of the man who had arrived in a 10-year-old pickup truck with a little girl in navy blue. Because you asked me if anybody was coming for us, he said, and I realized I hadn't thought about it from your side. Sophie stared at him. You did it for me? You're 7, he said. You shouldn't have to worry about whether people think we matter. She was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the room, at the people, at Whitaker's people taking their seats with smooth efficiency, at Gerald Langford's reconfigured expression, and then she looked back at her father. Do we matter? She asked. We've always mattered, he said. The room just didn't know it. 10 minutes before the ceremony was to begin, Mason stepped out through a side door into the garden that ran along the east wall of the hall. He needed 3 minutes of quiet, which he'd learned to take whenever he could find them, rather than waiting for a better time. The garden was narrow and lit with strings of small, warm lights wound through the bare branches of trees that would be beautiful in spring, but were currently beautiful in a different way. Stark and clear against the dark sky, stripped of everything unnecessary. He stood there breathing cold air and not thinking about much. The door opened behind him. Victoria came out still in her dress, which was either brave or reckless given the temperature, and she wrapped her arms around herself against the cold and stood next to him without saying anything for a moment. Your uncle's face, she said finally. I know. I genuinely thought he was going to cry. He wasn't going to cry. He looked like he was going to cry. She paused. Why didn't you tell me? About Whitaker? About any of it? Mason looked at the string lights. They swayed slightly in a wind that was too cold for the occasion. I was going to tell you everything after tonight, he said. I had it planned. I had a whole... He stopped. There was a plan. And the plan was to wait until after you married me? The plan was to wait until I was sure. Sure of what? He turned to look at her. She was watching him with an expression that was not angry. She'd passed through anger somewhere in the past 10 minutes and arrived at something more complicated, something that required more categories than anger. When my wife died, he started, and he saw her face change at the word. She always changed slightly at that word. Not with jealousy, he didn't think, but with something more like recognition, like the word landed in a place she understood. I had everything. I had an empire. I had Whitaker and 12 other people who called me Mr. Reed and moved when I walked into rooms. And you left. I went to Millhaven and I started fixing cars, and I rented the apartment above the garage, and I put Sophie in school there. He paused. And for 3 years, nobody knew. Nobody showed up with their head inclined. Nobody called me Mr. Reed. I was just the guy at the garage. And? She said. And I needed to know if you wanted the guy at the garage, he said. Not the empire, not the thing behind it. The man who actually shows up every day, who takes his kid to school in a truck with a bad knock in the engine, who irons his own jacket with an iron that leaks. Victoria was quiet. Because if you only wanted me once you knew, he said, then you didn't really want me. She breathed out slowly, her breath fogged in the cold air. That's either the most thoughtful thing anyone's ever done for me, she said, or it's completely insane. Probably both. Probably. She looked at the bare branches overhead. And what were you going to do if Whitaker hadn't showed up tonight? If none of them came? They were coming, I asked. But if they hadn't? He thought about it. Nothing, he said. We'd have gotten married anyway. I'd have told you everything, and it would have been fine. Because you didn't need them there. No, but Sophie did. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She reached over and took his hand, which was cold because he hadn't thought to bring a jacket out here. She was cold too. Neither of them moved toward the door. Mason, she said, I want you to know something. Okay, I knew, she said. Not the specifics, not the scale, but I knew there was more. I'm not naive. I run companies. I've sat across from powerful men for 6 years, and I know how they hold themselves, even when they're trying not to. She squeezed his hand. I knew you were more than you were telling me, and I chose you anyway, the version you were showing me. He looked at her. I just needed you to know that, she said. The empire doesn't change it, but I didn't want you thinking I was blindsided. Are you saying you're smarter than I thought? I'm saying I've always been smarter than you thought. He almost laughed. The cold, the string lights, the bare branches, and 500 people on the other side of a brick wall waiting for them. All of it felt suddenly and precisely right in the way that very few moments in a life ever felt right. Not perfect. The iron still leaked. The truck still knocked. Sophie's braids were slightly uneven, and his left lapel crease was off, and somewhere inside there was a room full of people who had spent the better part of an hour deciding what kind of man he was. But this was real. This moment was real. We should go in, he said. We should, she agreed. Neither of them moved for another 10 seconds. Then the side door opened and Sophie's head appeared in the gap, her braids slightly disheveled from what looked like an encounter with the back of a chair. They're waiting, she announced. Claire said it's impolite to make people wait, but she said it nicer than that. What did she actually say? Victoria asked. She said, they're ready whenever you are, but she meant hurry up. Victoria laughed. Fully, without calculation, the kind of laugh that had nothing to do with how it sounded. She let go of Mason's hand and took Sophie's instead, and Sophie let her, which was not nothing. Sophie did not let people take her hand easily. She evaluated first. She had evaluated for 3 months before she stopped flinching when Victoria reached for her, and then one afternoon she'd simply reached for Victoria first, and neither of them had mentioned it, and that had been that. The 3 of them went inside. The hall was quiet when they appeared. Not the silence of ceremony, not yet, but the particular held-breath silence of 500 people who understood that something was about to start. The string quartet shifted. The lights adjusted slightly. Someone near the front coughed once, and then was silent. Mason walked toward the altar. Sophie walked with him, her hand in his, her braids slightly undone, her chin lifted in that particular way she had when she was making sure people could see her face. He had not told her to do that. She had figured it out herself. The room watched them. And this time, the watching felt different. The altar at Saint Augustine Hall was simple by the standards of the room. White flowers, 2 candles, a short wooden railing that had seen decades of other people's promises. The officiant was a judge named Harlan Burke, who Victoria had known for 12 years and trusted to keep the ceremony clean and direct without unnecessary ceremony within the ceremony, which was the kind of thing Victoria cared about, and most people wouldn't have thought to specify. Mason stood at the front and watched her walk toward him and tried to hold the moment without squeezing it too hard. She walked alone. She had told her family she preferred it that way, and the family had registered their objections through the usual channels. Pointed silences, a conversation with Claire that Claire had diplomatically summarized as they had some feelings about it. But Victoria had not changed her mind, because Victoria rarely changed her mind once it had been made. That was one of the things Gerald frequently cited as both her greatest professional asset and her most persistent personal problem, depending on which conversation you were having with him. Sophie stood at Mason's left side. She had appointed herself to this position without being asked, simply moving there when they reached the front and inserting herself with the quiet certainty of someone who had decided where they belonged and was not entertaining alternate configurations. Judge Burke had looked at her briefly, and then looked at Mason, and Mason had given the smallest possible shrug, and Burke had nodded and proceeded. The string quartet finished something soft and slow. Victoria reached the altar. She looked at Mason, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a second, which lasted longer than a second, in the particular way that certain seconds do. "You made it outside," she said quietly, low enough that only he caught it. "You made it back in," he said. Sophie made a small sound that might have been impatience. Burke cleared his throat gently, and the ceremony began. The room settled. 500 people who had spent the last 40 minutes recalibrating their understanding of the evening, who this man was, what those cars meant, why Edward Whittaker had walked across that room and bowed his head, now found themselves doing something they possibly hadn't planned on doing when they arrived. Paying attention. Real attention. The kind you paid when you understood that something was actually happening rather than simply being performed. Mason wasn't watching the room. He'd stopped watching the room the moment Victoria appeared at the end of the aisle. He had a tendency in high-stakes situations to scan for threats. Years of operating in high-pressure environments had built that reflex into him, and it took active effort to turn it off. But somewhere between the garden and the altar, the effort had become unnecessary, and he'd let it go, and now he was just looking at her. She was nervous. He could see it in the way she held her flowers, too tightly, the stems slightly bent from the pressure of her grip, and in the small muscle working in her jaw that appeared when she was managing something she didn't want to show. He recognized these signs because he'd learned them over 18 months of paying the kind of close attention to a person that you paid when you understood that people showed you who they were in the small things, not the large ones. And the large ones only mattered if you'd already learned to read the small ones correctly. Burke spoke about commitment. He spoke about the nature of partnership. He used the word covenant once, which Mason thought was technically in the job description, but landed slightly heavy. Sophie shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Mason reached down without looking and steadied her shoulder, and she stilled. Then Burke said, "The couple has prepared their own vows," and Mason felt Victoria's grip on the flowers tighten another degree. She went first. She had not shown him what she'd written. He'd known she was writing something. He'd seen her at the kitchen table in her apartment 3 weeks ago, late at night, with a notepad and a glass of wine, and the particular focused frown she wore when she was fighting with language, trying to get it to do exactly what she needed it to do. He'd brought her water and gone to bed and not asked. She pulled a folded piece of paper from somewhere Mason hadn't noticed and held it for a moment before looking up at him. "I almost didn't write this down," she said. Her voice was steady. "I spent a week trying to memorize it because I thought having paper would make it seem like I wasn't sure, like I needed a safety net." She paused. "And then I realized that needing a safety net doesn't mean you're not sure. It means you're honest about how things can go." Someone near the front of the room shifted. A chair scraped softly against the floor. "I've run companies since I was 24, Victoria continued. I've sat across tables from people who were trying to take things from me, and I've held my ground, and I've won most of those rooms. I know how to read people. I know how to read situations." She looked down at the paper for a moment, then back up. "I did not know how to read Mason." A small ripple of something moved through the assembled guests. Not laughter. Something softer than laughter. "He doesn't perform," she said. He doesn't manage how he comes across. He just is. And I had spent so many years in rooms full of people performing that I had forgotten there was another way to be. She stopped. Her throat moved. The first time I brought him to a business dinner, he disagreed with my CFO in front of 12 people, and he did it quietly and without any drama, and he was right, and he never mentioned it again, and I drove home that night thinking, who is this man? In the third row, Mason saw one of Victoria's cousins, a young woman named Deanna, who had been among the louder voices in the pre-ceremony whisper network, sitting with her arms crossed and her face doing something complicated. The arms were still crossed. The face had stopped being complicated and become something more like attentive. Mason listens before he speaks, Victoria said. He listens the way most people don't, not waiting for his turn, actually listening. And that changed how I listened, and that changed me. She folded the paper. I promised to stay. Not just physically. I promised to keep showing up in the actual, daily, unglamorous sense of the word. I promised to be honest even when honesty is inconvenient for me. And I promised to keep learning how to be someone who deserves the way you pay attention. She stopped. Her eyes were bright, but she didn't cry, which Mason had the sense she'd worked for. He exhaled slowly. Burke nodded at him. Mason did not have paper. He had considered it and decided against it. Not because he was confident he'd remember everything, but because the things he needed to say were the kinds of things that either came out right when you looked at a person directly or didn't come out right at all, and writing them down first felt like trying to cheat the process. He looked at Victoria. I disappeared once, he said. When my wife died and Sophie was 4 months old, I took everything I had built and I walked away from it, and I drove to a town I'd never been to before, and I rented a room above a garage. He heard the room adjust around him, the slight intake of collective breath that came from information arriving without warning. I wasn't depressed. I wasn't broken, exactly. I just needed to find out if I was still a person when you removed everything that made people treat me like I was important. Sophie was looking up at him. He kept his eyes on Victoria. It turned out I was, he said. Not a particularly exciting one. I fixed cars. I cooked bad pasta. I watched too much television. I had a daughter who was funnier than me and smarter than me and kept asking questions I didn't have good answers for. He paused. But I was still there. The person was still there. He heard something behind him, a quiet, involuntary sound, and thought it might have been Whitaker, which would have been something, because in 20 years he had never heard Whitaker make an involuntary sound. I promised myself I wouldn't disappear again, Mason said. Not from a life. Not from a person. Not when things get hard. Not when the work stops being interesting. Not when I'm tired or angry or confused about what I'm supposed to be doing. He stopped. I'm promising you that now. I'll stay in the room even when the room is difficult. I'll tell you when I'm struggling instead of going quiet. I'll be here, specifically, concretely, in the daily way, because that's what I failed to do before, and I know what it costs. He hadn't planned the next part. It came out anyway. And Sophie, he said, looking down at her. She looked up at him with an expression of complete attention. I promise you the same thing, he said. Even more. Sophie nodded once, slowly, like they had just completed a negotiation that had been ongoing for 7 years. The applause began without anyone seeming to decide to start it. It came from several places at once, and then it spread. And then it was general and sustained, and somewhere in the middle of it, Sophie stepped forward and took both their hands at once, standing between them facing the room with a composure that was either theatrical or entirely genuine, and with Sophie was probably both. Judge Burke, who had performed over 300 ceremonies in 20 years and had seen most categories of wedding moment, looked at the three of them and said nothing for a beat, and then said, well, in a tone that didn't require elaboration, and then proceeded with the legal elements of the ceremony, which were brief and correct and sufficient. When Burke said the words that ended one part of the evening and began another, Mason kissed Victoria, and Sophie immediately said, finally, in a voice that was not as quiet as she apparently thought it was, and the laughter that came from that broke whatever remaining formality the room had been holding on to. The ceremony was over. The reception began, and the room, which had entered the evening as one kind of place, was now unmistakably another kind of place altogether. It was the table assignments that went first. The seating plan that Victoria's mother had spent 3 weeks perfecting, a careful architecture of social relationships and family politics, and careful distances between people who should not be adjacent to each other. Dissolved within 20 minutes of the reception starting, because the calculus that had produced it was based on a version of the evening that no longer existed. People moved. They found reasons to cross the room. Victoria's business colleagues, who had been placed in the outer ring of tables with the polite distance accorded to professional rather than personal relationships, were suddenly interesting to family members who had never shown curiosity about Victoria's work before. And Whitaker's people? 12 men and women who had flown in from Brussels and arrived in formation and now sat at 2 tables near the east wall with the easy comfort of people accustomed to new rooms, became the gravitational center of a social realignment that no seating chart had anticipated. Mason watched this from a position near the bar where he was drinking water and eating something from a small plate that he couldn't identify, but that tasted like it cost considerably more than anything he'd eaten in the past year. Whitaker appeared beside him with the quiet arrival of someone who had spent decades moving through rooms without creating disturbance. "The lamb," Whitaker said, nodding at Mason's plate. "Is that what this is?" "Rack of lamb with a rosemary reduction. I had the same thing. It's very good." Mason ate another piece. "How was Brussels?" "Tedious? Productive. The two are not mutually exclusive." Whitaker held a glass of something amber that he wasn't drinking so much as carrying. "You should know that 3 of the people in this room recognized me and have spent the last 20 minutes quietly attempting to determine what my presence here indicates about your financial position." "I know. 2 of them are Victoria's family." "I know that too." Whitaker turned slightly to survey the room with the patient thoroughness of someone who had spent a career reading rooms and had never lost the habit. "Her uncle is currently experiencing what I would characterize as a significant recalibration." Mason looked. Gerald Langford was across the room in conversation with 2 of Whitaker's associates, a man named Chen and a woman named Reyes, both of whom were impeccably professional, and both of whom Gerald would shortly discover held positions at the executive level of organizations he had spent years trying to access. Gerald's posture had changed since the ceremony. The careful condescension was gone. Something more uncertain had replaced it. Something that looked like a man rapidly reconstructing a puzzle he'd thought was finished. "He'll be all right," Mason said. "He embarrassed himself." He didn't know. "That's precisely what embarrasses people," Whitaker said. "Not being wrong, being visibly wrong in front of 500 witnesses." He paused. "Though I will say, his instinct to protect his niece, however misguided the execution, was not entirely without merit. The concern itself was reasonable." Mason looked at him. "A man with no apparent means shows up to marry a CEO," Whitaker said mildly. "From a certain vantage point, that's worth scrutinizing." "From a certain vantage point," Mason agreed. "The question is whether you scrutinize it as a threat to be eliminated or a question to be answered." Whitaker's glass turned slightly in his hand. He chose elimination. It didn't work out for him. Sophie appeared through a gap in the crowd, navigating adult legs with the practiced ease of a child who had spent years moving through spaces built for people larger than her. She had something in her hand, a small stuffed rabbit, cream-colored, with one slightly bent ear, that Mason hadn't seen before. She reached him and held it up. "Mr. Whitaker's assistant gave it to me," she said. "She said she brings it when she travels for good luck, and she wanted me to have it." Mason looked at Whitaker. "Patricia," Whitaker said. "She's had that rabbit since 1987. I'm not entirely sure what it means that she parted with it." "It means she liked me," Sophie said with the confidence of someone who had made this assessment and was not open to alternative interpretations. "Undoubtedly," Whitaker said. Sophie examined the rabbit, then looked up at Whitaker with the direct gaze she used when she was about to ask something she'd been holding for a while. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, "are you my dad's friend or his boss?" Whitaker considered this with more genuine attention than most adults gave children's questions. "Neither exactly," he said. "Your father and I have worked alongside each other for many years. He built something, and I helped him build it, and he was always very clear that he was in charge of what it meant." He paused. "I suppose you might say I'm a very senior colleague who happens to respect him considerably." "That sounds like a friend," Sophie said. "Perhaps it is." Whitaker said. She nodded, satisfied, and went back into the crowd, holding the rabbit against her side. Mason watched her go. She's going to be trouble, he said. She's already trouble, Whitaker said. That's a compliment. The evening had developed its own texture by now, the way good evenings did. Not uniformly joyful, not uniformly anything, but specific and real and moving through its phases in a way that felt less planned and more inevitable. Tables that had been stiff with social obligation loosened as the meal progressed. Conversations that had started as assessments became genuine. The music shifted from the background to something people were actually noticing. Victoria was in the center of it, moving between tables, talking to people, doing the 1,000 small things that made a room feel held together. Mason watched her do it with the particular combination of recognition and admiration he'd felt since the beginning. Recognition because he understood the work of it, the effort it took to make rooms feel easy, and admiration because she made it look as though no effort was involved. He was thinking about going to find her when Gerald appeared. It was not the Gerald who had approached him before the ceremony. That Gerald had been armored, deliberate, operating from a position of social confidence that he thought was unassailable. This Gerald was something different. His tie was slightly loosened. His face carried the specific expression of a man who had been very publicly wrong and was working through what to do with that. He stopped in front of Mason without preamble. "I owe you an apology," Gerald said. Mason waited. "What I said before the ceremony was—" Gerald stopped. He was not a man who apologized easily, Mason could tell, not because he lacked conscience, but because apologizing required admitting the limits of his judgment, and his judgment was the thing he'd built most of his life on. "It was unfair. I made assumptions." "You did," Mason said. Gerald looked briefly startled. He'd apparently expected more of a softening. "I judged you by what I saw," he said, which was exactly what I intended you to see, Mason said. Gerald stopped. "I live the way I live because I chose it," Mason said. "The truck is real. The garage is real. The apartment above it is real. I'm not performing a life, I'm living it. The rest of it exists, and it funds some things. And I take calls when I need to, but it doesn't define the day." He paused. "You saw a man who fixed cars and thought you understood the situation. The mistake wasn't the seeing, it was the thinking you understood." Gerald was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the reception moved and murmured. "You're not going to make this easy," Gerald said. Not accusatory. Almost, Mason thought, respectful. "You came over," Mason said. "That took something. I'm not ignoring that." "It's 30 years too late for me to start being cowardly," Gerald said, and it came out like something he'd said to himself before, like a principle he'd developed from a specific incident and held on to. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why stay in Mill Haven? Why the garage? You could—" He gestured vaguely at the room, at the evening, at the implication of everything the evening had revealed. "You could do anything." "I am doing something," Mason said. "I'm raising a kid in a place where she knows the neighbors' names. I'm fixing machines for people who need them fixed. I'm being around." He looked at the table nearest them, where two of Whitaker's associates were talking with a pair of Victoria's cousins who had looked bored 2 hours ago and were now leaning forward. "Power's interesting until it isn't. Watching your kid figure out how the world works, that doesn't stop being interesting." Gerald processed this. "Victoria's going to keep running the company," he said. Not a question. "Of course she is." "And you'll—" "Be at the garage," Mason said. "Take calls when I need to. Fly somewhere when something actually requires it. Come home." He looked at Gerald directly. "Whatever home ends up meaning, with two people who both have work they care about, and a kid who asks better questions than most adults." Gerald was quiet. Then he put out his hand. Mason shook it. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, because forgiveness implied a wound deep enough to require it, and Mason didn't operate that way. He had learned too early that carrying grievances was expensive, and the return on the investment was poor. But it was something, an acknowledgement, a small door that hadn't been opened before, and was now, slightly, ajar. Gerald walked away. Mason finished his water. He was setting down the glass when he felt a hand on his arm and turned to find Deanna, the cousin from the third row, the one whose arms had been crossed and whose face had been complicated, standing there with 2 glasses of champagne, one of which she held out to him. "I don't drink at events," he said. Thank you, though. She lowered the second glass. She was in her early 30s, dark hair, an expression that was still working through something. I was one of the ones talking before the ceremony, she said. I want you to know I'm not usually… She stopped. I was unkind. To someone I didn't know. That's not… I don't love that about myself. Mason looked at her. She met his eyes without flinching, which he respected. Sophie heard some of it, he said. Not to punish, just accurate. Deanna closed her eyes for a moment. I know. I saw her face. She opened them. I'm sorry. To you, and I'd like to apologize to her too if that's something that would be okay. It would probably be good for both of you, he said. She nodded and went to find Sophie, and Mason watched her go and thought that rooms were strange things. You filled them with people and assumptions and social hierarchies, and then something happened that broke the hierarchy, and suddenly you could see the people underneath. And sometimes the people underneath were actually worth knowing. Not always, but sometimes. The music shifted again, something with more movement in it, and the floor that had been empty began to fill. Victoria found him by the garden door. She had changed shoes. He noticed because she'd been in heels at the ceremony, and now she was in something flat, which meant her feet had made a practical argument she'd decided to listen to, which was one of the things he appreciated about her, the willingness to abandon a position when reality made a better case. How are you holding up? She asked. I'm fine. You always say that. It's usually true. She looked at the room. Gerald talked to you. He did. And? We shook hands. She seemed to weigh this. That's more than I expected. He's not a bad man, Mason said. He just operated on incomplete information. Most of what he said to me this morning was… She exhaled. He used the word trajectory 5 times, as though my life is a projectile. To be fair, Mason said, you do move fast. She gave him a look that was trying not to be a smile and not entirely succeeding. I'm serious. I know. He turned slightly toward her. He loves you. He's got the wrong model for how to show it, but the material is real. She considered this for a long moment, in the way she considered things she disagreed with but couldn't fully refute. You're more generous than he deserves tonight. Tonight's expensive, Mason said. Might as well spend it well. She laughed. Short, surprised, real. Then she reached out and fixed his lapel again. The left side, the same one she'd fixed before the ceremony, and her fingers stayed there a moment after the lapel was fixed. I need to tell you something, she said. Okay. Before tonight, I had a plan. She kept her voice low, even though the music covered most conversation. For how things would work. Logistically. The company, the travel, She stopped. I had a structure, a very detailed structure. I know you had a structure, Mason said. You have structures for everything. Yes. Well. She pressed her lips together. Some of it involved assumptions about what your life looked like, the scope of it. And some of those assumptions are going to need, we'll figure it out, he said. It's not simple. No. There are going to be decisions that… Victoria, he said it quietly. We'll figure it out. That's what the next 50 years is for. She looked at him. Something in her face settled. Not resolved, not simplified, but settled, the way a complicated equation settled when you stopped trying to eliminate variables and started working with them. 50 years is a long time, she said. It'll go fast, he said. They always say that. I'm starting to believe it. Across the room, Sophie was dancing with Deanna in the way that 7-year-olds danced, with complete physical commitment and zero self-consciousness, arms going in directions arms didn't usually go, the stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm and refusing to be put down. Deanna was laughing. Sophie was laughing too, the real laugh that Mason knew from the garage and the apartment and Saturday mornings when she'd come into the kitchen and catch him doing something ridiculous. The laugh that took her whole face. He watched his daughter laugh with a stranger who had been unkind and then been honest about it, and he thought that was maybe the best thing a room full of people could offer. Not the absence of mistakes, but the possibility of something after them. The night was getting late. People were beginning the slow gravitational drift toward departure that marked the end of gatherings. Coats retrieved, farewells extended, cars called. The music had shifted to something slower, and the floor had thinned to the couples who weren't ready to let the evening go yet. Whitaker found him one more time near the exit corridor, coat already on, Patricia, his assistant, waiting a respectful distance behind him with a phone in her hand that she was very deliberately not looking at. "We're heading to the hotel," Whitaker said. "We fly back in the morning." "Thank you for coming," Mason said. "You asked," Whitaker said simply, as though that were the entire explanation, which perhaps it was. They stood together for a moment in the particular silence of two people who had known each other across years and difficult circumstances and had arrived at a way of existing around each other that required very little maintenance. "She's remarkable," Whitaker said. "I know. And formidable." "More formidable than me," Mason said. "Possibly." Whitaker almost smiled. "In different ways." He looked toward the hall where Victoria was saying a long goodbye to someone's grandmother with a patience that looked genuine. "She'll fight with you," he said. "She fights with everyone. The question is whether she fights honestly." "She does," Mason said. "Then you'll be fine." He paused. "Not easy, but fine." He shook Mason's hand. Firm, brief, the handshake of someone for whom the gesture carried specific weight, and walked toward the exit with the quiet precision he brought to all movement. Patricia paused beside Mason for a moment. "She really loved that rabbit," she said. "Your daughter." "I'll take care of it," Mason said. Patricia nodded and followed Whitaker out. Mason stood in the corridor for a moment in the relative quiet, the music dampened by the walls, the voices blurred to something ambient and warm. He could hear Sophie somewhere in the main hall, her voice distinct even through walls in the way his daughter's voice had always been distinct to him. Not louder than other voices, just more specific, like a signal he was permanently tuned to receive. He thought about the drive to Millhaven that night, 3 years ago, in the same truck he'd pulled up in tonight. He'd driven for 4 hours in the dark with Sophie asleep in the back seat, in a car seat she'd almost outgrown, and the radio had been playing something he couldn't remember. And he'd had no particular plan except to stop moving at the first town that felt like somewhere a person could disappear. Millhaven had been that town. The garage had been in the first building with a "for rent" sign. Sophie had started school the following Monday. He had not planned on staying longer than a season. 3 years later, the Ford still knocked in the cold. The iron still leaked. The apartment above the garage had a draft from the north window that he'd been meaning to fix since October. And now he was standing in a wedding venue in a charcoal suit that was slightly wrong in one place, listening to his daughter's voice through the wall, waiting to drive his wife home. None of it was what he'd planned. Most of it was better. He went back into the hall. Sophie fell asleep somewhere on Route 9, about 12 miles outside Millhaven, with the cream rabbit tucked under her chin and her cheek pressed against the window in a way that was going to leave a mark. Mason watched her in the rear-view mirror at a red light, the slow rise and fall of her breathing, the slight part of her lips, the braids he'd done that morning now mostly undone, and felt the particular ache of watching a child sleep after a hard day. Not a bad day, just a day that had asked more of her than most. Victoria was in the passenger seat with her heels off and her feet tucked under her, which was something she did when she was tired in a way she didn't want to admit. She had her head against the window and was watching the dark fields pass outside, and she'd been quiet for about 10 minutes, which Mason had learned to read as the specific quiet of someone processing rather than withdrawing. The heat in the truck was unreliable. It worked on the driver's side and was approximately 50% effective on the passenger side. So Mason had given Victoria his jacket somewhere around mile 8, and she was wearing it over her dress now, which should have looked wrong, and somehow didn't. "She danced for almost 2 hours, Victoria said finally, without turning from the window. "I know. I didn't know she could dance." "She can't, technically," Mason said. "She just doesn't know that yet." Victoria smiled at the window. "Is that going to be a problem?" "For who?" "For her, when she figures it out." "She'll figure out she doesn't dance the way people expect, and then she'll decide she doesn't care," Mason said. "That's how she handles most things." Victoria turned to look at him. In the low light of the truck, with his jacket too big around her shoulders and her makeup worn down from a full evening, she looked less like a CEO and more like a person, which was something Mason had noticed about her from early on. That the person and the CEO were the same. That she wasn't performing one or hiding the other, but that certain circumstances brought different surfaces to the front. "How are you?" she asked. "Fine." "Mason." "I'm actually fine," he said. "Not deflecting, just fine." She studied him for a moment. "You handled tonight." "Tonight wasn't hard. Gerald apologized. We shook hands." "I know, I watched. I'm saying—" She stopped and reconsidered what she was saying. "You could have used tonight. The things Whitaker said, the way the room changed. You could have made it something, made a point, and you didn't." "What would the point have been?" he said. "I don't know. Something about—" She paused. "Vindication. I don't need vindication from Gerald Langford. Most people would. Most people carry their injuries around looking for places to put them down," Mason said. He kept his eyes on the road, which was narrow and dark out here. The kind of country road that didn't believe in streetlights. "I got tired of carrying mine. Takes too much energy, and the only person it costs anything is you." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "When did you figure that out?" "Slowly," he said. "Over a long time, badly at first." She seemed to understand this was as much detail as he was going to offer tonight, which was correct. There were conversations that required time and the right circumstances, and a country road at midnight after a long day was the right circumstances for some things and not others. They drove the rest of the way into Millhaven in a quiet that was not uncomfortable. The town came up gradually the way small towns did. A gas station first, then a diner that was closed, then the hardware store, then the familiar block of storefronts that Sophie had memorized in the way children memorize the geography of wherever they lived. Not because it was significant, but because it was theirs. The garage was dark. The apartment above it had the one light Mason always left on, the lamp in the kitchen, the one Sophie sometimes woke up at 3 a.m. to find burning, which she claimed helped her fall back asleep, and Mason had stopped questioning it because some things didn't need to be questioned. He carried Sophie up the stairs, still asleep, still holding the rabbit. She was heavier than she looked, which he always forgot between the times he had to carry her, and he navigated the narrow staircase with the practiced care of someone who had done this route in the dark many times. Victoria came up behind them and held the door. He laid Sophie on her bed, which had a slight lean to it, because one of the bed legs was not quite level, and he'd shimmied it with a folded piece of cardboard that kept sliding, got her shoes off, pulled the covers up. The rabbit went on the pillow beside her. He stood in the doorway for a moment looking at his daughter in her bed in the apartment above the garage in the small town where she'd learned to read and lost her first tooth, and developed strong opinions about which brand of peanut butter was acceptable. Victoria appeared at his shoulder. He felt her lean slightly against him, just her arm against his, and they stood there together for a moment in the light from the hall. "She really is something," Victoria said, barely above a whisper. "Yeah," Mason said, "she is." He pulled the door mostly closed. Sophie slept better with it not fully closed, another one of those things he'd stopped questioning. And they went into the kitchen, where the lamp was on and the room smelled like coffee from that morning, and the window above the sink had that draft from the north that he was still meaning to fix. Victoria sat down at the kitchen table. She still had his jacket on. She looked around the kitchen with the unhurried attention of someone seeing a space differently than they'd seen it before. Not because the space had changed, but because they had. "I've been here 4 times, she said. "5, he said. "You came once when you dropped something off for Sophie and didn't come up." She looked at him. "You saw that?" "Sophie told me." He filled the kettle and put it on. "She saw you from the window." "I wasn't going to intrude." "You weren't intruding. You had a routine," she said. "I didn't want to—" She stopped. "I spent a lot of time trying not to want too much too fast." He turned around and leaned against the counter. "Is that hard for you, not wanting things too fast?" "Yes," she said plainly. "I want things very fast. It's a significant professional asset and a recurring personal problem." She looked at the table, at a small scratch near the edge that Sophie had made with a pen 6 months ago and felt terrible about for a week. "I have been working on it for the last 1.5 years. "Since when?" "Since about the 3rd time you didn't call when I expected you to, and instead of assuming you'd lost interest, I tried assuming you had a reason." She traced the scratch with one finger. "That was new behavior for me." "Did it work?" "You called," she said. "So yes." The kettle started. He made tea, not coffee, because coffee at this hour was going to be a problem for both of them, and one of the small ways he'd learned to take care of himself in recent years was being practical about sleep. He set a mug in front of her and sat down across the table with his own. "Tell me something," she said. "What?" "What it was actually like the first year here." He wrapped his hands around the mug. Outside, a car passed on the street below, headlights sweeping briefly across the kitchen ceiling, and then it was quiet again. "Quiet," he said. "It was very quiet. Coming from the life I'd had, the offices, the calls, the constant, it was like stepping into a room where someone had turned the volume off." He paused. "Sophie was 4 months old. She didn't sleep. She cried at 2 and 4 and 6 in the morning for the first 3 months, and then she started sleeping through, and I almost woke her up because the silence scared me." Victoria was listening in that way she listened, completely, without filling gaps. "I didn't know how to be slow," he said. "Everything I'd built had been built fast, with urgency, because in those circles there's always someone moving faster than you, and standing still is the same as going backward. And suddenly I was in Millhaven, and the garage opened at 8 and closed at 5, and nobody called me after hours, and nobody needed a decision by morning." He looked at the table. "It took about 4 months before I stopped checking my phone every 20 minutes. 6 months before I stopped waking up at 5 expecting something." "And Sophie?" "Sophie normalized everything," he said. "Children do that. She didn't know that her life was supposed to be different. The garage was just where we lived. The guys at the shop were just the guys at the shop. The park down the street was just the park." He paused. "She gave me something to organize a day around that had nothing to do with money or decisions or quarterly anything. She needed lunch. She needed a bath. She needed someone to read to her badly enough to make it clear when I was reading in the wrong voice." "What's the wrong voice?" "I do voices when I read," he said. "She had opinions." Victoria smiled. "What kind of opinions?" "She told me my dragon voice sounded like I was trying to clear my throat," he said. "She was 5. She was completely right." Victoria laughed softly, her hands around the mug, the jacket still on her shoulders, the kitchen lamp casting the room in the particular warm yellow that had become familiar to him over 3 years, and was now, he was realizing for the first time tonight, going to need to become familiar to someone else. The thought settled on him with a weight that was not unwelcome but was real. "What are you thinking?" Victoria asked. She'd noticed the shift in his face the way she noticed shifts in faces. She was good at that. Too good sometimes, in the way that perceptive people could be too good at seeing things you weren't ready to share. "That this place is going to need to fit 2 adults, he said, "and I haven't fully worked out what that looks like." She considered this. "I have an apartment," she said, "in the city." "I know. It's 3 times the size of this." "I know that too." I'm not saying we have to move," she said carefully. "I'm saying there are options. Sophie's school is here," he said. "Her friends are here. The Hendersons next door. She goes over there on Wednesday afternoons because Ruth Henderson teaches her to bake, which is something I can't do because I have no patience for the precision of it." He paused. "I'm not moving Sophie. I'm not asking you to. But you have a company in the city. I have a company that I can run from wherever I have a phone and a laptop, and occasionally a boardroom," she said. "I've been running it from a laptop in this kitchen twice. On a Tuesday. Tuesdays are light." He looked at her. She looked back. They were both aware that the conversation they were having was a small version of a much larger conversation, and that the larger conversation was going to take more than one evening and more than one mug of tea, and that the details of it were going to be worked out through a series of smaller conversations and compromises and probably some arguments, because neither of them was the kind of person who agreed easily when they disagreed. "I want to be here," she said. Not plaintively, just directly, the way she said most things. "Not here as a compromise. Not here because it's what you need and I'm adapting. Here because—" She stopped. "I sat in this kitchen on a Tuesday, and I had the most productive 4 hours I'd had in 6 months. The city has a frequency. It's always at a certain pitch, and I didn't know I needed to be somewhere that didn't have that pitch until I was somewhere that didn't." "Millhaven's frequency is pretty low," he said. "Yes," she said. "It's very good." He turned the mug in his hands. The kitchen was quiet except for the draft from the north window, which made a faint sound against the frame that he'd never quite gotten used to and had somehow also never quite fixed. "There's a house," he said. She waited. 3 streets over on Alderman. It's been listed for 8 months. The owners moved to Florida and it sat. It needs work. The kitchen's wrong. The upstairs bathroom has a problem I haven't fully diagnosed yet. And something in the foundation needs attention. He paused. But it has a yard. And Sophie could walk to school. And it's big enough that 2 people with different jobs could both have space to do them. Victoria was very still. "You've been looking at houses. I've driven past it," he said, which is not the same as looking. "Mason. 12 times," he said. "Over the past 4 months. Sometimes Sophie was in the car, and she said it looked like a house that needed someone to want it." Victoria was quiet for a long moment. "She said that?" "More or less. She said it looked sad," which I interpreted as, "No, I understood." Victoria looked at the kitchen window where the draft was. "Can we see it?" "It's listed," he said. "I can call Monday." "I meant—" She glanced at the clock on the wall, which read 12:47. "I meant soon. It's almost 1 in the morning. I know what time it is." He looked at her. She had that expression she got when she'd decided something and was waiting for the logistics to catch up. He had seen that expression in various contexts over 18 months, and had learned that when it appeared, the decision was already made, and the conversation about whether to make it was technically moot. "Sophie's asleep," he said. "The Hendersons are right next door," she said. "Ruth Henderson taught me to bake on a Thursday, by the way. She's a night person. She once texted me at 11:30 about a pie." Mason looked at her for another moment. Then he put down his mug and stood up. They walked 3 streets over in the cold, and Victoria had changed out of her dress into a pair of Mason's sweatpants that were 6 inches too long and a sweater she'd left at the apartment 2 months ago, and she had her coat on over all of it, and she looked nothing like the woman who had walked down the aisle at Saint Augustine Hall 6 hours ago and exactly like herself. The house on Alderman was dark and still, with the particular stillness of empty spaces that had been empty for a while, the kind of stillness that became its own presence over time. There was a lockbox on the front door that Mason had the code for. The realtor had given it to him 2 months ago on the understanding that he might want to look sometime, which was the realtor's tactful way of acknowledging the 12 drive-bys without making it awkward. He opened the door and they stood on the threshold, and the smell of the empty house came out to meet them. Wood and cold, and the faint traces of whoever had lived here last. Victoria stepped inside. She moved through this front room slowly, hands in her pockets, looking at the ceiling and the walls and the windows and the bones of the space with the eye of someone who had bought and sold enough real estate to understand that a building was primarily a set of decisions waiting to be made. She went into the kitchen and turned on the tap and listened to the pipes and turned it off. She found the basement door and opened it and looked down into the dark and said, "What's the foundation issue?" "Southeast corner," Mason said. "There's some settling. It's not structural. It just needs attention." "Have you had someone look at it?" "I looked at it." "You fix cars," she said. "I fix things," he said. "I've looked at a lot of foundations." She closed the basement door and went upstairs. He followed. The upstairs was 3 bedrooms and the bathroom with the problem he hadn't fully diagnosed, and she stood in the doorway of each room briefly and looked. She stood longest in the room at the end of the hall. It was the biggest room, with 2 windows facing east and a closet that was large enough to actually function. She stood there in the dark, in his sweatpants and her coat, and looked at the windows where the glass showed a faint reflection of the street below. "Which room were you thinking for Sophie?" she asked. He indicated the one across the hall. Smaller, but with a window seat, which Sophie would appreciate because Sophie read in window seats whenever window seats were available. Victoria nodded slowly. Then she turned around and looked at the room they were standing in, at its dimensions, its ceiling, its light. And he understood that she was doing the thing she did when she was building something in her head, running the variables, seeing a version of something that didn't exist yet. "The bathroom can be fixed," she said. "Yes." "The kitchen needs to be redone." "Yes." "The foundation needs attention," he said, "not replacement." She was quiet for a moment. The house settled slightly in the cold. A small sound from somewhere below, the kind of sound old houses made when the temperature changed, the ordinary settling of a structure that had been standing for decades, and intended to keep standing. "I want to buy it," she said. "We'd buy it together," he said. She looked at him. "You've been driving past it for 4 months." "That's not Mason. You've been driving past a house for 4 months and not buying it because you were waiting." He didn't answer. "What were you waiting for?" she asked. He looked at the windows where the street outside was dark and quiet, and the trees at the edge of the sidewalk were the same kind of bare and clear as the trees in the garden at Saint Augustine Hall. "For this to be real," he said. "I wasn't sure it was real for a while." "What made you sure?" "Sophie reached for your hand first," he said. Victoria didn't say anything for a moment. In the empty room, in the dark house, that sentence sat between them with the weight of a true thing. "She told me about it," Victoria said finally. 3 weeks later. She said she'd decided I was staying, so she might as well get used to me." "That's Sophie's version of high praise," he said. "I know," she said. "It's the best compliment I've ever received." They stood in the empty room for another minute. Then Victoria turned and walked back toward the stairs, and he followed, and they went through the front door, and he locked the lockbox, and they stood on the porch of the house on Alderman in the cold at 1:15 in the morning. "Monday," she said. "Monday," he agreed. They walked back to the apartment. The town was completely quiet now. No cars, no movement, just the sound of their footsteps on the cold sidewalk and the distant bark of a dog from somewhere on the far side of the neighborhood. Sophie was still asleep. He checked. A habit he hadn't been able to break since her infancy, that last check before he went to bed himself. Just the few seconds in the doorway, making sure she was there and breathing and exactly where she was supposed to be. The rabbit was still on the pillow. Sophie had shifted at some point and was now on her stomach, which was how she slept when she was deeply asleep, when her body had stopped managing even the small work of position. He pulled her door mostly closed and went back to the kitchen, where Victoria was washing out the mugs with the focused efficiency of someone who cleaned when they were winding down. He stood next to her and dried them with the dish towel that had a faded image of a lighthouse on it that Sophie had picked out at a yard sale because she liked lighthouses without having a specific reason. They were both tired in the way that came after days that had asked a lot. Not depleted, not damaged, but fully used. The good kind of tired. The kind that came with a sense of having gone through something rather than having merely spent time. Victoria put the last mug in the cabinet and leaned against the counter. She looked at him with the expression she'd had in the ceremony, the one underneath the composure. Not scared, just real. "I've never done this," she said. "Done what?" "This." She gestured vaguely at the kitchen. "Lived somewhere, with someone, where the someone wasn't..." She stopped. "I've had relationships. They were mostly parallel. We occupied the same space but operated separately. Nobody washed mugs. I wash mugs because otherwise they pile up," he said. "I know why people wash mugs, Mason." "Sorry. I mean..." She pushed it off the counter. "I mean, I've never had a kitchen, in the sense of a place where someone was doing something ordinary and I was doing something ordinary next to them, and that was the point of it." She looked at the counter, at the dish towel with the lighthouse. "I'm going to be bad at it for a while." "Bad at what, specifically?" "Being ordinary," she said. "Being in a kitchen, not optimizing." "Sophie will help," he said. "She has zero tolerance for optimizing." "She told me last month that I was too scheduled," Victoria said. "She was eating cereal. She said it very casually." "What did you say?" "I said she was probably right." She paused. "She was." He reached over and turned off the kitchen light, and the room went dim with only the ambient light from the street coming through the window with the draft. In the half-dark, the apartment felt smaller and warmer than it looked in daylight, which was something he'd noticed in his first winter here and had found comforting in a way that was hard to explain. "You should sleep," he said. "I should," she said, but she was looking at the window with the draft, at the thin line of cold air that came in under the frame, and she didn't move. "The draft is from the north window," he said. "I've been meaning to fix it." "I know," she said. "You've mentioned it." "I'll fix it this week." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Don't." He looked at her. "Not yet," she said. She met his eyes. "I don't mind it." He understood then what she was saying and wasn't saying, that the draft was part of the texture of the place, that the imperfect things were part of what made it specific, that she didn't want him to smooth everything before she'd had a chance to know it as it was. He understood this because it was a version of what he'd spent 3 years trying to preserve, the authenticity of a life that hadn't been curated for anyone's approval. He nodded. She finally pushed off the counter and went toward the hallway. At the kitchen doorway, she stopped and looked back at him, and the light from the street caught her face at an angle. "Mason," she said. "Yeah. I'm glad you drove past that house 12 times. He looked at her. 13, he said. "I miscounted earlier." She almost smiled. She went down the hall. He stood in the kitchen for another minute by himself, which was what he needed. That last minute alone before sleep, the same way Sophie needed the door mostly closed, and the kitchen light on and the rabbit on the pillow. Everyone had their thing. His was a minute at the end of the day with no one watching and nothing required. He thought about the room on Alderman with the east-facing windows. He thought about what it would look like in morning light, which he hadn't seen yet but could imagine from the direction of the windows and the angle of the street. He thought about Sophie in the room across the hall with the window seat, reading something in the afternoon. He thought about the last 3 years and the next 30 and the 100 small decisions that would happen in between, and the arguments that would come when two people who both had strong ideas tried to build something together, and the mornings that would be harder than this one, and the evenings that might not feel as precisely right as this evening had felt. He thought about what Whitaker had said. Not easy, but fine. That seemed correct. That seemed like enough. He turned off the lamp and went to bed. Down the hall, through the mostly closed door, he could hear Sophie breathing. The faint, steady sound of his daughter asleep in the small apartment above the garage where they had landed and stayed and somehow made a life, before any of tonight had happened, before any of it was certain. The cold came through the north window. He didn't mind it either. The Monday call to the realtor happened at 8:17 in the morning, while Sophie was eating cereal and Victoria was on her second cup of coffee, and Mason was standing at the kitchen window with his phone, looking out at the garage below, where his first appointment wasn't until 9. The realtor's name was Dave Kowalski, and he had been selling houses in Millhaven for 22 years and had the particular patience of someone who had learned that real estate moved on its own schedule regardless of what anyone wanted. And when Mason told him they wanted to make an offer on the Alderman property, Dave said, "I had a feeling," in a tone that suggested he had driven past that truck parked outside the house enough times to form a theory. "Full asking?" Dave asked. Mason looked at Victoria, who was listening from the table while pretending to read something on her phone. She glanced up. "Full asking," Mason said. Sophie looked up from her cereal. "Did we buy a house?" "We made an offer," Mason said. "Is that the same as buying?" "It's the beginning of buying." Sophie processed this for a moment. "Is it the sad house?" "It's the house on Alderman," he said. She put her spoon down with the gravity of someone receiving significant information. "It won't be sad anymore," she said, "if we live there." Victoria looked at Sophie and then quickly looked back at her phone, which Mason recognized as the thing she did when something hit harder than she'd expected and she needed a second. Dave called back at 11 with the news that the sellers had accepted without counter, which he delivered with a satisfaction that suggested he took the house's 8 months on the market somewhat personally and was relieved it was resolved. The closing was set for 6 weeks out, which meant 6 weeks of the apartment above the garage, which was fine. The apartment was fine. It had been fine for 3 years, and it would be fine for 6 more weeks. What changed over those 6 weeks was quieter and more complicated than a house purchase. Victoria had a company to run, which meant she had calls at hours that didn't respect time zones, and a laptop that was always somewhere within reach, and a habit of thinking about work problems at 7 in the morning before she'd fully committed to being awake. Mason had the garage, which opened at 8 and closed at 5, and was predictable in the way he'd come to depend on that predictability. Sophie had second grade, which had its own internal politics and urgencies that she reported on with the seriousness of a foreign correspondent. They were 3 people with 3 different rhythms trying to learn how to occupy the same space, and they were not always good at it. The first real argument happened on a Wednesday night, 2 weeks after the wedding. Victoria had a call with a board member in London that ran until 9:30, and Mason had made dinner, pasta, the bad kind he'd made for 3 years, the only kind he reliably made. And it had been sitting on the stove getting cold since 8, and Sophie had eaten hers and fallen asleep on the couch waiting. And by the time Victoria came out of the bedroom where she'd been on the call, Mason was washing the pot in a way that communicated something without him having said anything. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "It ran over. I know. I told him 9 and he kept—" "I know, Victoria." She stopped. "You're angry." "I'm not angry," he said, which was mostly true. He was something more specific than angry. He was tired in the way of someone who had spent years managing a household alone and had almost forgotten that there was supposed to be another adult now, and the almost forgetting had caught him off guard. "You're something," she said. He set the pot in the drying rack. "Sophie waited up for you." Victoria looked at the couch where Sophie was asleep with the television on low. Something crossed her face. "I didn't know she was waiting." "She doesn't announce it," he said. "She just stays up." The silence in the kitchen had weight. "I'll do better with the calls," Victoria said. "I'm not asking you to cut calls short," he said. "I'm asking—" He stopped. He wasn't entirely sure what he was asking. This was the part of adjusting to another person that nobody had good language for. Not the major conflicts, which were easier to name, but the minor friction of two different ways of living trying to find a shared shape. "I'm asking you to tell me when it's going to run long," he said finally, "so I can tell Sophie, so she can go to bed instead of waiting." Victoria nodded. "That's fair. And I'll figure out how to keep pasta warm," he said, "because apparently I've been making it wrong for 3 years. The tension eased fractionally. "You have been making it wrong for 3 years," she said. She seemed to decide this was not the moment for the pasta conversation. "I'll tell you when calls run over." "Thank you." She went and sat on the couch next to Sophie and gently moved Sophie's feet, and Sophie stirred and looked up with the unfocused expression of a child waking from the edge of sleep. "You came out," Sophie said, not accusatory, just noting it. "I did," Victoria said. "I'm sorry I was late." Sophie considered this with her eyes still half closed. "It's okay," she said. "Work is busy sometimes." "How do you know?" "Daddy's work is busy sometimes too," Sophie said. "He stays late when a car is complicated." She yawned. "Are you staying over?" "Yes." "Okay." Sophie closed her eyes again. "Don't talk loud. I'm sleeping." Victoria looked at Mason over the back of the couch. He looked back. "She's very reasonable," Victoria said quietly. "She has her moments," he said. He came around the couch and picked Sophie up, which involved some negotiation with a half-asleep 7-year-old who was technically too old to be carried but was currently making no move to walk under her own power, and carried her to bed. When he came back, Victoria had heated the pasta on the stove and set 2 bowls on the table and was standing over them with an expression of cautious optimism. "Did I fix it?" she said. He looked at the bowls. "Depends. Did you add anything?" "Salt," she said. "And I turned the heat up at the end." He sat down. He tried it. It was marginally better. "The pasta itself is still wrong," he said. "I know," she said. "You have to salt the water." "Nobody told me that." "It's on the box." "I don't read the box." "Mason," she said, with the particular patience of someone who had decided that this was a hill she was willing to gently die on, "you have to salt the water." "I'll try it next time." "You'll forget." "Probably." She sat down across from him, and they ate the marginally better pasta in the kitchen with the draft and the lighthouse dish towel, and the argument was not resolved so much as absorbed into the ongoing project of learning each other's friction points and building the small habits that made them manageable. That was how it went, those 6 weeks. Not dramatic, not easy, just the steady work of 2 people and a child constructing something that had no blueprint. The closing on the house on Alderman happened on a Thursday afternoon in a conference room at Dave Kowalski's office that smelled like printer toner and old carpet. David put out a plate of cookies that nobody ate and kept apologizing for the number of pages requiring signatures, which was a lot of pages. Sophie had come because Mason hadn't wanted to leave her with the Hendersons for a 3rd afternoon that week, and she sat in the corner chair doing homework with the focused patience of a child who had been told this was important and had taken that at face value. When they signed the last page, Dave shook both their hands and said, "Congratulations. with the warm relief of a man who had watched a house sit on his listings for 8 months. Sophie looked up from her homework. Is it ours now? It's ours, Mason said. Even the sad parts? Especially the sad parts, he said. She seemed satisfied with this and went back to her homework. The first time they walked through the house on Alderman as its owners was different from the walkthrough at 1 in the morning. The daylight changed everything. It came through the east windows of the main bedroom in long, flat strips that showed the dust in the air and the scuff marks on the floor, and the place on the wall near the window where a previous owner had painted over something, and the paint had settled unevenly over the years. Victoria stood in those light strips and turned slowly and said, "The floors are good." And Mason crouched down to look at a section near the baseboard and said, "Mostly," and they had a 20-minute conversation about refinishing versus replacement that resolved nothing but established the terms of future negotiations. Sophie had gone directly to the room across the hall, the one with the window seat. She sat in the window seat and looked out at the street below with her chin in her hands and her legs dangling, and she stayed there for a long time without saying anything. Mason came in eventually and sat on the floor below the window seat. "What do you think?" "I think it needs a rug," Sophie said. "What kind of rug?" "Blue," she said. "Dark blue, like the ocean." "You've never seen the ocean." "I've seen pictures," she said. "I want a rug that looks like that." "Okay." She was quiet for another moment, looking out the window at the street where 2 kids she didn't know yet were riding bikes in slow circles on the sidewalk. "Daddy?" "Yeah." "Is this going to be our real home?" He leaned against the wall below her. "What makes something real?" "If you stay," she said. "If you don't leave." "We're not leaving." She thought about this with the thoroughness she brought to things that mattered. "What about the apartment?" "We'll keep the garage," he said. "I still work there." "But we sleep here." "When it's ready, yeah." She nodded slowly. Below on the street, the kids on bikes turned a corner and disappeared. The room was very quiet, in the way of empty houses that were about to stop being empty. "Daddy," Sophie said. "Yeah, I think it already knows we're here," she said. About the house, the way she sometimes said things that were obviously a child's thing to say, and also somehow not wrong. "Maybe it does," he said. The work on the house started the following weekend. Mason was doing most of it himself, which was not as impractical as it sounded. He had spent 3 years around the garage developing a working knowledge of most residential repair, had contacts for the things beyond his ability, and had the particular relationship with physical work that came from using it as a way to think. There was something that happened in his head when his hands were doing something concrete and demanding. The rest of it quieted down. The decisions, the calls, the ongoing calculations of a life that was larger than it looked from the outside. They all receded when he was replacing baseboards or pulling up old caulk or lying on his back under a sink figuring out why the drain was slow. Victoria worked with him on the weekends, which was not something he had expected her to volunteer for, and not something he would have asked for if she hadn't. She was not naturally suited to construction work. She was not patient with tools that required calibration or tasks that required the same motion 40 times before they produced a visible result. She had strong opinions about color that were occasionally useful and occasionally created 20-minute discussions about paint samples that ended in compromise. She measured things twice, and then measured them a third time in a way that Mason found endearing and she found necessary. And they had had the following exchange so many times it had become a kind of shorthand. "Mason, I think this is off by about a 1/4 inch. It's fine. It's not going to sit level. It'll be fine." And then 3 hours later, one of them would be right and the other would say nothing about it, which was also a system of sorts. Sophie helped on the Saturdays when she didn't have plans with the kids from school, who were slowly becoming her people. A girl named Juniper, who was loud and decisive, a boy named Cal, who collected strange rocks and showed them to Sophie with a seriousness she matched because she understood that people's serious things deserved to be treated as serious. Sophie sanded. She was good at it. The repetitive motion suited her focus, and she'd developed a critical eye for the texture of surfaces and would run her hand along a section and say, "There's still a rough patch here," with the exactness of someone who was going to be very good at noticing details when she grew up, or was already, in ways that had nothing to do with growing up. 4 weeks into the work, Mason was in the basement dealing with the southeast corner. the settling that needed attention, not replacement, when his phone rang. He looked at the screen. It was a number he recognized but hadn't expected today. Robert Cho, who ran the Eastern Division of the infrastructure business. He almost let it go to voicemail. Then he answered. Robert? Mason, sorry to call on a Saturday. It's all right. What is it? A pause. The particular pause that preceded complicated information. The Harwick situation has developed. Mason set down the tool he'd been holding. How developed? We have a competing offer on the Portsmouth contract. Someone moved fast, within the last 72 hours. We think it's Stanton Group. The Stanton Group. Mason had not thought about Marcus Stanton in over a year, which had been a deliberate choice and apparently an insufficient one. Stanton ran a smaller infrastructure firm that operated primarily through undercutting competitors and maintaining the kind of relationships with municipal contacts that technically lived in a gray area and practically lived somewhere darker. He and Mason had crossed paths twice in a previous life, and both times Stanton had operated exactly as his reputation suggested. What's the exposure if they take Portsmouth? Mason asked. It affects our northeastern pipeline by about 15%, Robert said. Not catastrophic, but it opens a gap that could compound if Stanton moves on Bridgeport in the spring like we think he might. Mason looked at the southeast corner of the foundation. The crack was clean and stable. Settling, not structural, the kind that filled and held if you did it right. He had the materials upstairs. He'd been planning to spend 2 hours on it today. I need the Harwick documents by this evening, he said. Have Chen send everything. I'll look at it tonight. You sure? It's a weekend and you just… Robert, he said, send the documents. Yes, sir. He hung up and stood in the basement for a moment. Above him, he could hear Sophie's footsteps crossing the kitchen floor, and Victoria's voice saying something, and Sophie's voice answering, and the sound of a drawer being opened and closed. The ordinary sounds of a Saturday in the house that was becoming their house. He went upstairs. Victoria was at the kitchen counter with a paint chip in each hand, holding them up against the wall in the changing light, which was a reliable way to spend 40 minutes deciding nothing. Sophie was at the table with a bowl of crackers and the rabbit, who attended most meals in a supervisory capacity. I have to do some work tonight, Mason said. Victoria looked at him. Not at the paint chips? At him. She had that ability to switch from one kind of attention to another without any visible transition, and she used it now, reading whatever was in his face. How much work? She asked. A few hours. Something came up on the Portsmouth contract. Stanton? He paused. He hadn't mentioned Stanton to her, which meant she'd learned it through other channels, which meant she'd been paying more attention to his business than she'd told him. He filed this for later. Probably, he said. I've heard of him, she said carefully, through some of our media contacts. He has a way of appearing. Yes, Mason said, he does. Sophie was watching this exchange with the particular attention she reserved for conversations between adults that she correctly identified as being about something with edges. Is somebody being bad? She asked. Somebody's being competitive, Mason said. It's different. Sophie considered this distinction. Is it, though? Victoria made a small sound. Sometimes, Mason said. Sometimes it really is different. Sophie was not fully convinced but accepted the answer for now, which meant it would return in another form within 48 hours, because that was how her mind worked. She put things in temporary storage and retrieved them when she'd thought about them long enough to have better questions. That evening, after dinner, Mason sat at the kitchen table with Robert's documents and worked through them with the systematic attention he'd spent years developing. Not fast, but thorough. The kind of thoroughness that came from understanding that speed in this kind of analysis was how you missed the thing that mattered. Victoria worked at the other end of the table with her own laptop, which was the shape their evenings often took now. Two people in the same room doing different work, which was different from the parallel existence she'd described in the kitchen weeks ago, and better than it in ways that were hard to name precisely. Around 9, Sophie came out in her pajamas with the rabbit and climbed into the chair next to Mason and leaned against his arm. Can't sleep? He asked. I was asleep, she said. I woke up. What woke you? The house, she said. He looked at her. The house made a noise? It always makes noises, she said. But they're different noises than the apartment. She pressed closer. Not bad different, just different. You'll get used to them, he said. I know, she said. I just wanted to be here for a minute. He put his arm around her and she settled into his side and looked at the documents on the table with the complete absence of curiosity about their content that was somehow the most restful thing in the room. Victoria glanced over and her expression did the thing it did. The small shift that wasn't quite a smile, more specific than that. Sophie lasted about 12 minutes before she was visibly losing the fight with sleep again, her head getting heavier against Mason's arm, her eyes closing and opening and closing. He walked her back to bed and stood in the doorway of the room with the window seat. They were still sleeping at the apartment, technically, but Sophie had decided the window seat was hers and had staged the room accordingly, with the dark blue rug they'd found at an estate sale in November that was almost exactly the right color, and 2 books on the window seat ledge and a drawing she'd made of the house taped to the wall beside the window. He looked at the drawing for a moment. It was in crayon. Sophie's skill with crayon was approximately matched to his skill with pasta, which was to say functional rather than impressive. The house was yellow in the drawing, which it wasn't in reality but might become, depending on how the exterior paint conversation went. There were 4 figures in front of the house, 2 tall ones and a smaller one, and beside the smaller one, a small cream-colored shape that was clearly meant to be a rabbit. He went back to the kitchen. She drew us, Victoria said. She'd seen him looking. She showed me last week. I saw. She gave us the right number of arms, Victoria said. That felt like progress. He sat back down at the table. The Portsmouth situation is manageable, he said. Stanton moved fast, but he moved sloppily. There are things in the contract terms we can use. Do you need to go anywhere? She asked. Not for this. He paused. There may be a meeting in Boston in the next few weeks. One day, probably. Okay. You're not going to ask about it? She looked at him. Should I? Most people would want to know more. I trust your judgment about when to go and when not to, she said. I don't need to know the details of every call unless you want to tell me. She paused. I have the same expectation in return. I don't explain every board interaction. You trust me on those. I do, he said. Then we're aligned, she said, and went back to her laptop. He sat there for a moment looking at her, at the focused angle of her head, the slight tension in her shoulders that meant she was in the middle of something requiring concentration, the coffee cup near her right hand that had been empty for an hour and that she kept almost reaching for and then not. He had learned all of these things in 18 months and continued to learn them because people were not static and the learning did not have an endpoint. And that was either the most exhausting thing about being close to someone or the most compelling, depending on the day. He went back to the Portsmouth documents. They worked until 11. He resolved 2 of the 3 issues and left notes for Robert on the 3rd with a clear instruction for Monday morning. Victoria finished whatever she'd been finishing and closed her laptop with the specific click of someone who had decided that was enough for tonight and meant it. She looked at the table, at the documents, the laptops, the 2 coffee cups. This is a lot, she said. Tonight was unusual, he said. I don't mean tonight. She looked at him. I mean, generally, what you carry, what you've been carrying, alone. She paused. I knew it was there, but sitting across a table from it is different from knowing it's there. You carry things too, he said. I know, but I have 30 people who help me carry mine. She pressed her lips together. Who helped you? Robert, he said. Chen and Reyes. Whitaker, in the big things. And personally? He looked at the table. Sophie, he said. Sophie helped me carry it, which is... He stopped. Which is not nothing, but it's also not fair. She's 7. She's very capable for 7, Victoria said. That's not the point, he said. The point is she shouldn't have had to be. Victoria was quiet. Then she said no, simply. She shouldn't have. It was the honest answer, and he appreciated that she gave it without padding. They had had enough conversations by now that she understood he did not need things softened, that he preferred the accurate version even when the accurate version was harder. I'm here now, she said, not as a promise of perfection, just as a statement of fact. I know, he said. I'll mess it up sometimes, she said. The calls that run long, The days I go into work mode and forget to come out, I will absolutely forget to salt the water. I know that too. But I'm here, she said. That part I'm sure of. He looked at her across the kitchen table, in the house on Alderman that had been sad and was not sad anymore. With the east windows dark and the northwest wind coming through the crack he had not yet fixed, and Sophie asleep in the room with the window seat and the dark blue rug and the crayon drawing of 4 figures in front of a yellow house. I know, he said again. And this time the words were not just acknowledgement. They were something more settled than that. The specific feeling of a man who had spent years managing alone, becoming aware, in the concrete daily way, that he was no longer doing that. Not easy, not resolved, not without the ongoing friction of 2 strong people trying to share a life without losing what made them the people they were, but present, real, and for the first time in a long time, genuinely not alone. The wind moved through the crack. Neither of them reached to close it. The Boston meeting happened on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of February, 6 weeks after the Portsmouth situation had been resolved, and 2 weeks after they'd moved the last boxes from the apartment above the garage into the house on Alderman. Mason drove up early, before 6, in the dark and cold of a February morning that couldn't decide whether it wanted to snow. Sophie had been asleep when he left. Victoria had been awake. She was always awake before he expected her to be. And she'd been standing in the kitchen in the gray pre-dawn making coffee she hadn't yet poured. And she'd handed him a travel mug without being asked and said, "The Stanton meeting," the way she said things she'd been thinking about and was only now giving voice to. "Probably," he said. "Be careful," she said. He'd looked at her. "Careful how?" "The way you're careful when someone is playing a longer game than you can see yet," she said. "Stanton doesn't move on things like Portsmouth unless Portsmouth is a step in something else." He took the travel mug. "I know. I know you know," she said. "I'm saying it out loud anyway." He kissed her, which she received with the slight distraction of someone still running calculations in their head, and went down to the truck in the dark. The meeting was in a building in the financial district that Mason had been to before years ago, in a different configuration of his life. The elevator bank in the lobby still had the same slow left elevator and the same fast right one, which was the kind of thing you remembered when a place had mattered to you at some point, and you'd paid the kind of attention to it that mattered places collected. He took the right elevator, 17 floors. Conference room with the view of the harbor that was gray this morning under a sky trying to decide about the snow. Robert Cho was already there. Chen and a lawyer named Pauline Marsh, who Mason had worked with for 6 years and trusted absolutely, were there. A man from the municipal authority named Greaves, who had been the contact on the Portsmouth contract and was currently looking like someone who had recently realized the position he was in, was there. Marcus Stanton was not there yet. He arrived 8 minutes late, which was a calculated 8 minutes, late enough to signal that his time was the organizing principle of the room, not early enough to seem like he'd rushed. He was 61, trim in the way of men who worked at it, silver-haired, and carried himself with the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades being the most dangerous person in rooms and had grown accustomed to the particular comfort of that position. He looked at Mason when he came through the door, and something passed across his face that was too controlled to be surprised but was in the neighborhood of it. "Reed," he said. "I heard you'd gone quiet." "Millhaven," Mason said. "It's about 2 hours north." "I know where it is." Stanton took his seat across the table. He had 2 people with him, a lawyer and someone Mason didn't recognize, who had the specific careful blankness of a person paid to observe and record. "I didn't know you were still involved in the northeastern work." "I'm involved in everything I built," Mason said. Stanton settled. "Fair enough." The meeting was about the Portsmouth contract, which Stanton had entered a competing bid on with terms that were aggressive in ways that Pauline had identified as aggressive, and that the municipal authorities' Greaves had apparently found attractive without fully reading the language in the subcontracting provisions, which was where the actual problem lived. Mason had spent 3 hours on those provisions the week before and had identified 4 places where the terms, once the initial contract period ended, shifted in ways that were technically legal and practically extractive. This was Stanton's pattern. Mason knew it because he'd watched it operate twice before in different cities with different contracts. And the mechanism was always the same. Come in low, lock in the relationship, restructure in year 2 when the switching cost was prohibitive. It was not illegal. It was not even unusual. It was the kind of thing that happened when municipalities needed projects done and didn't have the internal capacity to read the fine print with sufficient paranoia. Mason walked Greaves through the provisions, slowly, not condescendingly. He'd made that mistake once, years ago, and had learned that the goal was not to demonstrate the problem, but to ensure the other person genuinely understood it, which required a different approach. Greaves was not a stupid man. He was an overworked man who had been presented with attractive surface terms and had not had adequate time or support to dig further. The difference mattered. Stanton watched this process with the controlled stillness of a man who had been in enough rooms to know when something was going against him, and had made peace with being in those rooms anyway. When Mason finished, Greaves sat back in his chair and looked at the papers in front of him with the expression of someone who had just seen a thing clearly for the first time and was working out what to do with that clarity. "This isn't what we were told the provisions meant," Greaves said. He wasn't looking at Stanton when he said it. He was looking at his own papers. "The provisions mean what they say," Stanton said, smooth, unruffled. "Language in contracts often sounds more concerning than it is in practice." "In practice," Pauline said, "it means the authority is locked into renegotiation terms where Stanton Group controls the ceiling, and there's no escalation mechanism that doesn't involve litigation." Stanton looked at Mason, not at Pauline, at Mason. "You always did prefer the long explanation," he said. "I prefer the one that's accurate," Mason said. "This is competitive bidding," Stanton said. "We came in with better numbers." "Your numbers are better in year 1, Mason said. "By year 3, the authority would be paying 18% above our rate, with no exit clause that doesn't trigger a penalty." He looked at Greaves. "We can document all of it." Greaves looked at Stanton. There was a long pause in the room, the kind that meant a decision was being made that everyone present understood the significance of. "I think," Greaves said carefully, "we need to have our legal team review the provisions before we move forward with either party." Stanton nodded once. The nod of a man who knew this meant the competing bid was dead, not because he'd been caught doing something illegal, but because the thing he'd been doing had been seen clearly, which in certain rooms was equivalent. He gathered his papers with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had lost rounds before and knew that losing a round was not the same as losing. At the door he paused. He looked back at Mason. "You know I'll come back at Bridgeport," he said. Not a threat, just an accurate statement of his own intentions. "I know," Mason said. "And you'll be in Mill Haven," Stanton said. "Fixing cars." "Fixing things," Mason said. "Yes." Something in Stanton's face moved. Not quite respect, but the adjacent thing, the acknowledgement between people who understood the same game. He nodded once and left. The room exhaled. Robert looked at Mason. "Bridgeport is in April," he said. "I know," Mason said. "We'll be ready." He was back in Mill Haven by 4. He pulled the truck into the garage, which he did first before going to the house, partly because there was a car in Bay 2 that he'd left half-finished the day before, and partly because the garage was still the organizing center of his daily life in a way that was hard to explain to people who thought of it as a downgrade from what he'd had before. It wasn't a downgrade. It was a different thing. It was the place where the work was physical and immediate, and the problems had clear solutions, and the satisfaction at the end of a day was concrete in a way that balance sheets were not. He finished the work on the car in Bay 2, a '09 Civic with a persistent misfire that had turned out to be a cracked distributor cap, which was the kind of problem that looked complicated from the outside and was straightforward once you found it. He called the owner, a woman named Bev Orland, who worked at the elementary school and had been driving the car on 3 cylinders for 2 weeks because she'd been afraid of what the repair would cost. He told her the number. She went quiet for a moment. "That's it?" she said. "That's it," he said. "I thought it was going to be—" She stopped. "Okay. Yes. Thank you." He locked up and walked the 3 streets to Alderman. The house looked different in February than it had when they'd first seen it in November. The bare trees in the front yard had iced slightly at the branch tips from a freezing rain 2 days ago, and the ice caught the last of the afternoon light in a way that was inadvertently beautiful, the way things sometimes were when they weren't trying. The yellow paint, Sophie had won the exterior paint argument in the end, which surprised nobody, was brighter against the gray winter sky than it had looked on the chip, which Victoria had initially considered a problem and had come around on after 3 weeks of living with it. Inside, he could smell something cooking before he got the door fully open. This was relatively new. Victoria had started cooking in January, which she had announced not as a decision, but as something she was simply going to do and would report on the results, which was how she approached most things she was uncertain about. The results had been variable. There had been a soup in week 2 that Sophie had eaten without complaint, which Mason had recognized as meaningful because Sophie had opinions about soup. There had been something with chicken in week 3 that had been, by common if unspoken agreement, not repeated. There had been a pasta, correctly salted water, correctly timed, unremarkable, and exactly right, that had arrived on the table on a Thursday with no fanfare and had been eaten entirely without leftovers. Mason came into the kitchen. Victoria was at the stove with the particular focused attention she brought to tasks she had decided to master, which meant she was probably on her 3rd attempt at whatever this was, and the first 2 had gone into the compost with the quiet efficiency of someone who did not believe in dwelling on failed iterations. Sophie was at the kitchen table with homework spread across half the table, and the rabbit occupying the other half in a way that suggested the rabbit had rights to the table that Sophie was not disputing. "How was Boston?" Sophie asked without looking up. "Good," he said. He set his keys on the hook by the door, which was a hook Victoria had installed in the 2nd week because she'd said watching him set his keys on the counter every day was going to become a problem for her, and he drilled the hook in that evening, and he'd been using it since, and it had turned out to be a legitimate improvement. "Did you fix the problem?" Sophie asked. "Part of it," he said. "There's more in April." Sophie nodded as though April were a reasonable timeline for problem resolution, which perhaps it was. Victoria turned from the stove. She looked at him with the quick reading she did when he came back from something that had had stakes, checking not for damage exactly, but for where he was, what state he was carrying. It was something he'd noticed her do from early on and had never commented on because it was one of those things that didn't need commenting on, that worked precisely because it existed quietly. "Stanton," she said. "Withdrew," he said. "For now." "Bridgeport." "April," he said. "Robert's on it." She turned back to the stove. "Sit down. This needs 10 more minutes and I need to focus." He sat down across from Sophie. "What's that?" he asked, nodding at her homework. "Fractions," she said with the flat effect of someone describing a natural disaster. "You know fractions." "I know what fractions are," she said. "That's different from knowing them." "Fair point." He helped her with fractions for 10 minutes. Sophie was better at them than she thought, which was a pattern with her, the tendency to underestimate her own competence at things that didn't come instantly. And then Victoria put food on the table, and the 3 of them ate in the kitchen of the house on Alderman, which smelled like something that had been made with actual effort, and tasted like something made by someone still learning, which was to say, it tasted like where they were. It was not the best meal anyone had ever eaten. The seasoning was slightly off in one direction that was hard to name. Victoria knew it and said nothing, and Mason knew it and said nothing, and Sophie said, "It needs more of that orange stuff." And when Victoria asked her to clarify, Sophie pointed at the paprika and turned out to be correct. "She's right," Victoria said, tasting it. She said it with the particular expression of someone making a note. "I usually am," Sophie said. "You're 7, Victoria said. "Almost 8, Sophie said. "In 3 months." 3 months is almost, Sophie said. Mason ate his dinner and listened to this exchange, and felt the specific and unshowy contentment of a man who had spent years eating dinner alone and now did not. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of thing you could put in a speech. It was the weight of a fork in his hand and the sound of voices talking about paprika and fractions at a table in a house that had been sad and was not sad anymore. After dinner, Sophie helped clear the table. She had been assigned this task at the apartment years ago and had continued it at the house without being asked, which Mason took as evidence that certain things stuck when you started them early enough, and then announced she was going to read in her room, which meant the window seat, which was where she went when she wanted to be alone without being alone, in proximity to people without being in conversation with them, which was a need Mason recognized because he had the same one. He and Victoria cleaned up. They had divided the kitchen tasks without discussing them, which was how a lot of the domestic logistics had settled. Not through negotiation, but through the quiet self-organization of two people paying attention to what the other person avoided and filling in accordingly. Mason washed. Victoria dried and put away. The lighthouse dish towel had moved from the apartment to the house and lived now on the oven handle, slightly faded from 3 years of use. "I want to tell you something," Victoria said. She was drying a pot. "Okay." "I talked to Gerald today." He looked at her. "He called," she said. "He doesn't usually call on weekdays, he considers it an intrusion, and he has this whole thing about respecting people's schedules that mostly I think is about his own schedule." She set the pot down. "He called to say that he'd been thinking about the wedding, specifically about the things he said to you before the ceremony." Mason waited. "He said—" She paused. "He said he'd had a conversation with one of Whitaker's associates at a conference last month. Chen, I think. And Chen told him something about the way you built the infrastructure business, about the early years when it was just you and Robert and one project, and how you operated." She turned to look at Mason. "Gerald said he'd spent the last 2 months understanding who you actually were, and he wanted me to know that he was wrong in the specific way he was wrong. Not just generally wrong. He said, 'I judged the surface and missed the depth,' and I don't think he said something that honest in 20 years. Mason thought about Gerald in the wedding hall, the careful condescension, the questions about trajectory. He thought about the handshake afterward. He thought about the 2 months since, in which Gerald had sent a single card, actual card, through actual mail, that said congratulations and nothing else, which Mason had found oddly more meaningful than a longer message would have been. "How did you leave it with him?" Mason asked. "I told him I'd let you know he called," she said, "and that if you wanted to have a conversation with him, you'd reach out. That's very diplomatic. I've been practicing," she said. He finished washing the last pan. "I'll call him," he said. "This week." She looked at him. "You don't have to." "I know." He dried his hands. "But he did something hard. That deserves a response." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's what I mean, you know." "What?" "When I said you changed me," she said. "In the vows. That's the specific thing." She was looking at the counter, at the pot she'd just dried. "You respond to the hard things people do instead of waiting for them to do the easy ones. I spent years in rooms where people waited for the easy version, the path of least resistance, the thing that costs nothing." She paused. "You don't do that." "It costs something," he said. "It just costs less than you'd think." She considered this. "I'm still learning the accounting," she said. He hung the lighthouse dish towel over the oven handle. "You're doing fine." The chicken thing in week 3 was a learning experience. It was a disaster. "A learning experience that looked like a disaster," he said. "Those are the useful ones." She picked up her phone from the counter and looked at it and put it back down. The gesture of someone checking for things and finding nothing that required immediate action, which in Victoria's professional life was a small victory. She had been, over the past 2 months, actively and visibly working on the boundary between her work hours and the hours that were not work hours, which was a boundary that had not meaningfully existed for her in years, and was being rebuilt with the same methodical attention she brought to structural problems. It was not clean. There were still evenings when the laptop came out at 9 and stayed out until 11. There were mornings when a call started before Sophie was up, and Mason made breakfast alone with the one-sided murmur of Victoria's professional voice coming from the other room. But the working on it was real, and the real effort was visible, and visible effort was not nothing. An hour later, after Sophie had been read to and had negotiated the door, mostly closed, and the hall light question with a brief and business-like firmness, Mason sat on the back porch. The back porch needed work. It was on the list, the long list that had shrunk considerably over the past weeks, but retained its core of medium-term projects, of which the porch was one. The boards were soft in 2 places, and the railing had a section that was more optimistic than structural, and in the spring he was going to deal with both. For now it was February, and the porch was cold but solid enough for sitting if you chose a board you trusted, and Mason had identified which boards he trusted and used them. He sat out there in the cold without a particular agenda. This was the thing he did at the end of days that had held a lot. Not processing, exactly, not reviewing, just existing for a few minutes without the requirement of being useful to anything or anyone. It was the thing the garage had given him in the early years, and that the house was now learning to give him, this specific permission to be still. Victoria came out 15 minutes later with a blanket she'd taken off the back of the couch and her own coat, and the expression of someone who had decided this counted as fresh air. She sat down next to him in the good board she'd identified herself 2 weeks ago, which was the correct board and adjacent to his. They sat together in the cold and didn't talk for a while. The town was quiet. Millhaven in February was very quiet. The cold kept people inside and the dark came early, and the streets by 9 o'clock had the particular stillness of a place that had decided it was done for the day and wasn't making exceptions. Somewhere on the far side of the block, a dog barked twice and stopped. The ice on the tree branches caught the light from the kitchen window. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria said. "Yeah." "The woman," she said. "Sophie's mother." She paused. "You don't have to—" "Her name was Claire," he said. Not the same Claire as his assistant at the wedding. A different Claire, a name he said rarely enough that it had retained its specific weight. She died of a cardiac event 14 days after Sophie was born. She was 28. Victoria was still beside him. "She was the first person I ever built anything with," he said. "Not the business. The business I built alone. And I'm not sure that was the right choice, but it was the choice I made. I mean, a life. She was the first person I wanted to build a life with." He looked at the iced branches, at the light they caught. "And then she was gone in a way that had no cause that could be fixed and no one to be angry at, and no sequence of decisions I could go back and change. And I had a 14-day-old daughter and an empire, and I didn't know what any of it was for." The cold moved between them, and neither of them tried to stop it. "That's when you went to Millhaven," Victoria said. 4 months later, he said. "I stayed in the city for 4 months trying to be who I'd been before, and it didn't work. You can't be who you were before certain things. The things change the shape of you, and then the old shape doesn't fit." He paused. "Millhaven wasn't a plan. It was just where I stopped." "And Sophie?" "Sophie was the reason stopping was possible," he said, "because stopping doesn't mean quitting if you're still doing the most important thing." He thought of what he'd said to Sophie years ago, something about having more room, and about what Sophie had understood from it that had maybe been slightly different from what he'd meant, and how sometimes you said things without knowing the full meaning of what you were saying. "She saved my life," he said, not dramatically, just by needing lunch every day. By needing someone to read to her in the wrong voice, by asking questions I didn't have answers to and making me think about why I didn't. But Victoria put her hand over his on the porch railing. Her hand was cold. His was too. "I'm not her," Victoria said. "I don't want you to—" "You're not," he said. "You're not supposed to be, and you're not." He turned his hand over so they were palm to palm. "What I found in Millhaven after Claire, the quiet, the slowness, the version of a life that fit the shape I'd become, that was mine. I'm not trying to rebuild something I lost. I'm building something I didn't have before." He looked at her in the dim light of the back porch in February. "That's different." She leaned her head against his shoulder. It was not a graceful movement. She misjudged the angle slightly and corrected, and the correction was more visible than she probably intended. This was one of the things he'd learned about Victoria, that her professional life kept well hidden, that she was not naturally graceful at the physical language of closeness. She had learned to project ease in rooms full of people, had spent years perfecting that projection, but the actual small mechanics of proximity, leaning on someone, reaching for a hand, the minor physics of two people being near each other without agenda, these were things she was still learning. She'd told him once that she'd spent so long being the person in the room who did not need anything from anyone that the need itself had become unfamiliar, and the unfamiliarity showed up in the small adjustments. He didn't say anything about the adjustment, he just let her settle. They stayed out until the cold became unreasonable and then went in. 3 months later, in the first week of May, Sophie turned 8. She had requested a small party. Small was her word, and she'd meant it, in the way she meant most things, she said, with 6 friends from school, which included Juniper, who arrived 45 minutes early and immediately began reorganizing the snack table in a way that Sophie watched without objection, because Juniper's reorganization was, objectively, and improvement, and Cal, who brought Sophie a rock from his collection and presented it with a formality that the occasion seemed to call for, and Sophie received with the seriousness it deserved. The party was in the backyard, which Mason had spent the previous Saturday making presentable. The two soft boards on the porch replaced, the railing section fixed, the winter debris cleared from the grass that was beginning to come back now in the particular tentative way of grass in early spring. Victoria had strung lights between the porch and the fence, which she'd done herself. Standing on the stepladder with the stubborn focus she brought to things she'd decided to do, and Mason had come out to help, and she'd said, "I have it," and he'd gone back inside and she'd had it. Gerald came. This was not something Mason had anticipated when he'd made the phone call in February. The call had been brief and direct. Mason had said he'd heard Gerald reached out and he appreciated it. Gerald had said he'd been wrong and said why, and Mason had said he understood and that was that. And the call had ended with a cordiality that was real, if not warm. But then in March, Victoria mentioned that Gerald had asked if Sophie's birthday was in May, and Mason had said yes, and Victoria had said she'd told him, and then 2 weeks before the party, an email had arrived from Gerald asking if it would be appropriate to come, and Mason had written back one sentence, "Yes, come." Gerald arrived with a present wrapped badly. The wrapping had the look of someone who had done it himself for the first time in many years and hadn't fully committed to the task, and a manner that was uncertain in a way Mason had not seen on him before. He stood at the edge of the backyard with a glass of lemonade and watched the children run around with the expression of a man recalibrating how to exist in a space where he had no role to perform. Sophie found him within 10 minutes. This was Sophie's way at parties. She moved through the space checking on people the way she moved through any space, identifying who was comfortable and who wasn't and responding accordingly. She walked up to Gerald and looked at him with the direct appraisal that had made Whitaker crouch down in a wedding hall 4 months ago. "Are you my uncle?" she asked. Gerald looked startled. I'm Victoria's uncle, yes." "So that's my uncle," Sophie said. Not a question. Filing it. "I suppose it is," Gerald said. "Okay," Sophie said. "Do you want to see my rock? Cal gave it to me. He says it's feldspar." Gerald looked at the rock Sophie produced from her pocket. Small, gray-pink, unremarkable to an untrained eye and apparently significant to Cal. "It's very nice," he said. "It's a metamorphic rock," Sophie said. "That means it used to be something else, and then pressure changed it." She turned it over in her hand. "Cal says that's how most interesting things happen." Gerald looked at the rock. Then he looked at Sophie. Then he looked across the yard at Mason, who was standing near the lemonade table and had heard all of this and was looking back at him. Something in Gerald's face settled. The uncertain quality dissolved and something more genuine replaced it. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the thing that came before warmth, the willingness to be in a place without armor. "Your friend Cal sounds like a smart kid," Gerald said. "He is," Sophie said. "He's a little weird, but I think that's fine." "I think that's fine too," Gerald said. She put the rock back in her pocket and went to rejoin Juniper, who had moved on from the snack table and was now attempting to organize a game that 6 children had varying levels of interest in. Gerald watched her go. He walked over to Mason. They stood together at the lemonade table. "She's remarkable," Gerald said. "I know," Mason said. "She told me a rock was a metamorphic rock," Gerald said. "She's 7. 8, Mason said. "As of today." 8, Gerald corrected himself. He was quiet for a moment. "She's right, you know. About pressure." "Usually is," Mason said. Gerald held his lemonade with both hands and watched the children in the yard, and Mason stood beside him, and neither of them said anything for a while. And the silence between them was different from the silence in the wedding hall 4 months ago, which had been the silence of 2 people in opposition. This was the silence of 2 people who had found, through the long route, a piece of common ground and were standing on it without needing to make a speech about it. "I want you to know," Gerald said finally, "that whatever I thought before, I understand now that I was wrong about the important parts." "I know," Mason said. "I'd like—" Gerald paused. "If you're willing. I'd like to be an uncle in the actual sense, to Sophie. She doesn't have many family connections on this side." Mason looked at him. "Show up," he said. "That's the whole job. Show up and mean it." Gerald nodded, the nod of a man making a commitment he intended to keep. Later that evening, after the party guests had gone home and Sophie had eaten her cake, chocolate, her specification, with the precise amount of frosting she had described to Victoria in enough detail that Victoria had relayed it to the bakery verbatim, Mason sat on the fixed back porch in the last of the May light. Sophie came out and sat next to him. She had the rabbit. She had not left the house without the rabbit in 4 months and showed no signs of reconsidering this policy. The rabbit's one bent ear had been bent longer than anyone tried to remember, and the cream color had become something slightly less cream with the wear of being carried everywhere. But Sophie had declined all offers to wash it on the grounds that washing it would change it, and this was not a negotiation anyone had won. "Good birthday?" Mason asked. "Yeah," she said. She'd leaned against his arm. "The feldspar was my favorite present." "Better than the books?" "The books are good," she said carefully, "but you can get books anywhere. Cal picked that rock out of his collection specifically for me. That's different." "It is," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The May evening was warm in a way that February hadn't suggested was coming, which was always the surprise of seasons, that they actually arrived, that the thing you couldn't feel when you were cold eventually became real. "Daddy," Sophie said. "Yeah. I've been thinking about something." "What?" "The thing you said at the wedding, about having more room." She turned the rabbit over in her hands. "I didn't understand it then, but I think I do now." He looked at her. "What do you think it means?" "I think it means that when people don't come for you, you get to choose who fills the space," she said, "instead of it being filled for you." She thought about this. Like, if everybody came, the room would be full of people who came for their own reasons. But because it was empty, then the people who came because they wanted to. He was quiet for a moment. "Where did you get that?" "I thought about it," she said. "For a long time, since the wedding." "That's a 4-month thought." "It's a complicated idea," she said, not defensively, just accurately. He put his arm around her. She settled against his side with the rabbit and the feldspar rock in her pocket and the 8 candles worth of a birthday behind her, and he held his daughter on the porch of the house that had been sad and wasn't anymore, in the town where they'd stopped without a plan and stayed without intending to. Victoria came out with 2 mugs. She handed Mason one and sat on his other side and pulled her feet up onto the porch railing in the way she did when she'd decided a place was hers, which she'd done with this porch sometime in March when he hadn't been paying attention. The 3 of them sat on the porch in the May evening. It was not quiet. Sophie started telling a story about something Cal had said at school, an involved story with many characters and a complicated internal logic. And the story required periodic commentary from both adults, and the commentary required response. And the response led the story somewhere entirely different from where it had started, the way Sophie's stories always went, and the evening moved around them in the light way of evenings that were not asking anything of anyone. Mason held his mug and listened and felt the specific weight of a life that had been rebuilt from nothing useful twice, once badly and alone, and once better and not alone, and thought about what he knew now that he hadn't known before. He knew that starting over was not a straight line, and that the version of yourself on the other side of it was not the version you planned. He knew that hiding what you had was not the same as knowing what mattered, that he'd spent years conflating the two, and they were genuinely different, and the difference was worth knowing. He knew that a room full of people who respected you meant less than one person who knew you on a Tuesday morning when nothing was at stake, and that love that came with full information was a different substance entirely from love that came with the edited version. He knew that Sophie had been carrying things a 7-year-old shouldn't carry, and that the carrying had made her strong in ways she deserved to be strong and in ways that shouldn't have been required of her, and that the best he could do now was make sure the weight was distributed better going forward. He knew that Gerald Langford was standing in his own kitchen in the city right now, probably writing a note on his calendar to call Sophie next week, and that the note was going to be awkward, and the call was going to be awkward, and over time the awkwardness was going to become something else, and that was how most real things happened, through the awkward middle stage that people wanted to skip and couldn't. He knew that Marcus Stanton was going to come at Bridgeport in April, and that Robert and Pauline and Chen would be ready, and that the preparation would be tedious and necessary, and that he was going to drive to Boston for one day and come back the same afternoon, and that when he came back, Sophie would ask whether he'd fixed the problem and he'd say yes, and she'd nod and go back to whatever she was doing, Because to Sophie, the fixing of problems was expected and not remarkable. And he found this attitude both entirely manageable and enormously reassuring. He knew that the north window in the kitchen still had its draft, which he was going to fix in the fall. He decided on fall. Victoria had stopped asking. He knew that the iron still leaked. He knew that the Ford knocked in the cold and would continue to knock unless he did something about it, and that he was going to do something about it next winter, and that the knowing this without urgency was itself a form of peace. Sophie finished her story. The ending was, by her admission, inconclusive. "What happened to the rabbit in the story?" Victoria asked. "He went home," Sophie said. "Where was home?" "Wherever he decided," Sophie said, with the confidence of someone who had thought about this and was done thinking about it. "That's the whole point." Mason looked at the May sky above the backyard of the house on Alderman, at the string lights Victoria had hung between the porch and the fence, at the tree in the far corner that was going to need trimming in June, at the grass coming back in the particular tentative way of things coming back. He had spent years trying to find the right answer to the question of what a life was for. He had looked for it in building things, in earning things, in walking away from things. He had looked for it in Mill Haven, in the garage, in the daily mechanics of raising a child and keeping a truck running and fixing other people's problems for a reasonable fee. He hadn't found an answer exactly, but he had found something that worked better than an answer, a specific morning, a specific table, a specific person asking whether he was making the face again. The weight of carrying something heavy and having someone notice. The draft from the north window and the decision to leave it for now, because the place was real in all its imperfect specificity, and real was the only thing that had ever been worth keeping. Sophie leaned heavier into his arm. Victoria's shoulder was warm against his. The evening moved around them. The lights held.